I'm Aubrey Davis. I'm 34 years old. For the past 10 years, my parents told every single member of our extended family that I abandoned them. They spun an elaborate, tragic story about a selfish daughter who moved away for corporate ambition and left her aging mother and father to fend for themselves in the harsh Alaskan winters. They repeated this fiction at Thanksgiving dinners I was never invited to. They whispered it during holiday phone calls I never received. They built an entire social identity around being my innocent victims. It worked perfectly because I never showed up to defend myself. They thought no one would ever question their carefully rehearsed narrative. They relied on my silence. But they made a fatal miscalculation. They forgot about the blizzard 10 years ago. They forgot about the woman who lived right next door to us. And at my cousin's funeral in front of 200 grieving guests, our 80-year-old former neighbor stood up, gripped her heavy oak cane, and revealed exactly what she witnessed the night my parents actually kicked me out into the snow with nothing but a trash bag. They did not just lock the door. They changed the deadbolts while I stood shivering on the front porch. I spent a decade building a new life from scratch, assuming they just wanted me gone because I was a burden. I did not realize until much later that my eviction was a calculated financial maneuver. They needed me out of the picture to forge legal documents and steal a blind trust left to me by a man I never knew. They erased me to fund their luxury lifestyle. And they used my forced absence to gather sympathy from every aunt, uncle, and cousin in Anchorage. They played the role of abandoned parents so flawlessly that the entire community rallied around them. I watched from afar as they accepted casserole dishes and pity, while I worked double shifts to pay for a tiny studio apartment. I swallowed the injustice because I thought fighting back would only make me look as crazy as they claimed I was. But watching them perform their fake grief at a funeral was the final straw. Welcome back to Linda Vengeance, quiet stories about women who stop absorbing the blame for families who betrayed them. If you have ever been the scapegoat in your own home, this story is for you. Tell me your age in the comments and hit subscribe so the next story finds you. Let me take you back to the day the ice finally cracked. It was a Tuesday in mid-January, and Anchorage was locked in a deep freeze. I stood in the vestibule of the Holy Cross Chapel, brushing a thin layer of frost from the collar of my dark wool coat. The temperature outside hovered near single digits. Inside, the heavy air smelled of damp wool floor wax and white lilies. I am a maritime logistics director. I spend my days routing heavy cargo through unpredictable Pacific Northwest storms. I handle multi-million-dollar shipping schedules where a single delay costs thousands. My job requires a person to look at a chaotic map and find the most efficient path forward, regardless of the incoming weather. Stepping into my cousin David's funeral required that exact same clinical detachment. Walking through the arched double doors felt like stepping onto a hostile foreign shore. I felt the collective stare before my boots even touched the center aisle runner. Aunts, uncles, and longtime family friends turned their heads in unison. The whispers started immediately rustling through the wooden pews like dry leaves over chilled floorboards. A cousin I used to play hide-and-seek with averted her eyes, pretending to read a hymn book. An aunt who used to bake me cookies leaned over and muttered something behind a gloved hand. I ignored the stares. I kept my posture straight and my gaze fixed firmly on the stained glass window at the front of the chapel. I anchored myself in the environment, refusing to give them the satisfaction of seeing me flinch. My mother, Beatrice, sat in the front row. Even from the back, I could see the rigid line of her spine. She wore a black velvet dress and a wide-brimmed hat that shielded her face from the harsh overhead lights. She was already performing. A tall figure stepped out from the second row and planted himself directly in my path. My older brother, Jackson. He wore a dark, bespoke suit that pinched tight around his shoulders, as if he had gained weight he refused to acknowledge. In his right hand, he gripped a set of key fobs, his knuckles white as he fumbled with the plastic casing. The locking mechanism on his imported sedan was jammed, a persistent issue with luxury cars in this sub-zero climate. He squeezed the plastic, his jaw tight, his frustration mounting with each failed click. I noticed the lack of control instantly. Jackson always needed to dictate the room. When he could not command a simple piece of plastic, his anxiety bled through. He shoved the keys into his coat pocket and closed the distance between us. He leaned in close enough for me to smell the stale peppermint mints, failing to mask the sour scent of cheap whiskey underneath. "You have some nerve showing your face here today," he whispered. His words were clipped tight, pushing through gritted teeth. "Do not ruin Mom's grief, Aubrey. Sit in the back, keep your mouth shut, and leave the second this is over." I did not step back. I did not drop my gaze. I studied the rapid pulse at his temple and the faint sheen of sweat gathering on his forehead despite the drafty room. He was not just angry. He was nervous. He looked like a man standing on a trapdoor waiting for the latch to spring. I realized then that his desperation had nothing to do with mourning David. It had everything to do with maintaining his grip on our family. "I am here to pay my respects to David," I replied. My tone was flat, hollowed out of any emotional static he wanted to provoke. Nothing else. His eyes narrowed, searching my face for a crack in my composure. "You do not belong here anymore," he said. "You made your choice 10 years ago." "You mean the choice you made for me?" I countered smoothly. A muscle ticked in his jaw. He opened his mouth to reply, but the organ music swelled, drowning out whatever threat he planned to deliver. I stepped around him, leaving him standing rigid in the middle of the aisle. I walked past the glares and took a seat on the hard wooden bench in the very last row. I folded my hands in my lap. The murmured judgments continued around me, a steady drone of disapproval. I sat perfectly still, watching my mother at the front of the room. Beatrice was flanked by towering floral arrangements, dabbing her dry eyes with a lace handkerchief. Every gesture was deliberate, a calculated stage play for the Anchorage elite. I knew the script she intended to follow. She would wait until the priest invited family members to speak, and then she would turn this memorial into a monument for her own fake suffering. I just had to wait for the performance to start, observing the fractures in her facade, long before the old woman with the cane would bring the entire cathedral to a halt. The chapel acoustics amplified the rustle of dark silk as Beatrice stood up from the front pew. She did not walk to the pulpit. She floated, leaning heavily on Jackson for support. Jackson offered his arm, portraying the steadfast pillar of the Davis family. He guided her up the 3 short carpeted steps to the microphone, his posture projecting fierce protectiveness over his grieving mother. Aubrey watched them from the back row, her hands resting flat on the thighs of her wool coat. She cataloged every subtle movement. She noted the way her mother adjusted the microphone stand with a slight calculated tremor in her fingers. She observed the way Beatrice kept her chin lowered, forcing the entire congregation to lean forward in their seats to catch her opening words. Aubrey viewed this room the same way she viewed a maritime routing map. The people in the pews were unpredictable weather systems. Beatrice was a storm front gathering strength, and Aubrey was the reinforced hull of a cargo ship built to withstand the freezing impact. Beatrice cleared her throat, a fragile sound that echoed through the stone nave. She began by speaking of David. She recalled a summer afternoon at the lake, a fishing trip, a borrowed bicycle. The anecdotes were brief, polished over the last 4 days for maximum emotional resonance. For 3 solid minutes, it was a genuine memorial service. The mourners nodded their heads, dabbing at their eyes. Then Aubrey heard the subtle shift in cadence. The tempo of the speech slowed down. The tone deepened. "We hold on to our children," Beatrice murmured, her voice catching just enough to sound authentic. "We give them our youth, our warmth, our shelter from the bitter cold. And when they leave us, we pray they remember the home that built them." Aubrey felt the air pressure in the room drop. The pivot had arrived. This was the exact maneuver her mother used at every social gathering, every charity gala, every holiday dinner. Beatrice was taking the raw grief of a nephew passing away and seamlessly weaving it into her own personal mythology. She was hijacking a funeral to reinforce her status as a martyr. David stayed close to his roots. Beatrice continued, resting one pale hand over her heart. He knew the value of loyalty. He knew that family is all we have when the winter comes. Some of us learn that lesson the hard way. Some of us sit in empty houses, waiting for a knock on the door that never comes. We wait for a daughter to remember the parents who sacrificed everything to keep her safe from the ice. A low, collective hum vibrated through the wooden pews. It was a sound of shared indignation, a unified frequency of pity for the matriarch and disgust for the traitor sitting in the back. Aubrey traced the deep grain of the oak bench beneath her. She felt the heavy stares of the people sitting a few rows ahead of her. They shifted their weight, casting sideways glances over their shoulders. They wanted to see the shame on her face. They wanted to witness her shrinking under the weight of her mother's sorrow. Up at the pulpit, Beatrice produced a pristine lace handkerchief from her sleeve. She pressed it carefully beneath her right eye, then her left. Aubrey noted the precise angle of the cloth. Her mother was an expert at preserving her expensive makeup. There were no actual tears falling from her eyes. The weeping was entirely auditory, a series of measured inhales and staggered exhales, magnified by the sound system. It was a flawless technical performance. As Beatrice lowered the handkerchief, the chapel lights caught a flash of deep green on her lapel. Aubrey stopped tracing the wood grain. Her gaze narrowed, locking onto the sharp, metallic glint. Pinned to the dark velvet of her mother's dress was a vintage emerald brooch. The large central gemstone was flanked by intricate silver filigree, a heavy, old-world design that looked entirely out of place against Beatrice's modern, tailored outfit. Aubrey recognized the piece immediately. It was not a family heirloom from the Davis side. It had belonged to the silent partner of the original shipping firm, the man whose name was rarely spoken in their house. Years ago, Aubrey had found that exact brooch hidden in a locked cedar box at the back of a high shelf in the den. When she asked about it, Beatrice had snatched it away, her face pale, claiming it was a worthless piece of costume jewelry left behind by a forgotten tenant. Yet here it was, gleaming under the cathedral lights, displayed like a stolen crown jewel. The sheer audacity of wearing it today, a symbol of a hidden lineage paraded in front of a grieving town, sparked a cold realization in Aubrey. The brooch was a deliberate taunt. It was a trophy. It was proof that her mother believed she had won the long game, claiming not just the estate, but the very history of their bloodline. Jackson placed a reassuring hand on Beatrice's shoulder. He looked out over the crowd, his expression stern, demanding respect for his suffering mother. He was the dutiful son, managing the estate, running the businesses, holding the fragile pieces of their lives together. Or so the story went. Aubrey remembered the desperate grip he had on his frozen car keys minutes earlier. She remembered the sour smell of cheap liquor masking his breath. Jackson was playing a role just as hard as Beatrice. They were a paired act, feeding off the validation of the Anchorage elite. Without this audience, their entire empire of lies would collapse. "I never stopped leaving the porch light on," Beatrice said, her voice rising a fraction, filling the cavernous room. "Even when the blizzards hit, even when the nights stretched on into months and years. Because a mother never stops hoping that the child who turned her back will eventually find her way out of the cold." The congregation was fully captivated now. The mourners were no longer thinking about David. They were entirely focused on the tragic figure of Beatrice Davis. Aubrey kept her face perfectly neutral. She refused to grant them the emotional reaction they desperately carved out for her. She did not lower her head in shame. She did not cross her arms defensively. She sat tall, a solitary figure against the dark-paneled wall, emitting a sterile, clinical energy that repelled their silent judgments. Then Beatrice crossed the final boundary. She lifted her head and looked straight down the center aisle. She raised her right hand and pointed a single, trembling finger toward the very back of the chapel. "We must pray for those who have lost their way," she declared, her voice echoing off the stained glass. "We must pray for those who come back, not out of love, but out of guilt." The effect was instantaneous. 200 people turned their heads in unison. The rustling of coats and the creaking of wood echoed like a tidal wave crashing through the room. Every aunt, uncle, business partner, and neighbor locked their eyes on Aubrey. The hostility was a tangible force, a heavy blanket intended to suffocate her. This was the public humiliation designed to break her resolve. This was the moment she was supposed to crumble, to weep, to flee out the double doors in disgrace. Aubrey did not move. She met the gaze of the entire room with unblinking frost. She looked at her cousin's widow, who sneered in disgust. She looked at the family attorney, who frowned with deep disapproval. She looked back at her mother, whose pointed finger was beginning to shake with actual physical effort. Aubrey's silence was a vacuum. It absorbed their outrage and offered nothing in return. The prolonged stare-down began to stretch. The dramatic pause Beatrice engineered was supposed to end with Aubrey's surrender. Instead, the unyielding eye contact was unnerving the crowd. The quiet composure of the accused did not match the narrative of the guilty daughter. People began to shift uncomfortably, looking back toward the pulpit, waiting for the matriarch to release the tension. Jackson leaned into the microphone, his composure slipping a fraction. "Thank you, Mom," he muttered, trying to guide her away from the podium by her elbow. Beatrice resisted digging her heels into the carpet. She wanted the final word. She wanted to see Aubrey break. She gripped the edges of the wooden pulpit, her knuckles turning white. Just as Aubrey prepared to endure the excruciating finale of this theatrical morning, a sharp, distinct sound cut through the heavy silence. A heavy piece of oak slammed against the hardwood floorboards. Once, twice. The sharp noise ricocheted off the stone walls, demanding immediate obedience. From the third row, a figure stood up, rigid and commanding, refusing to be ignored. Mrs. Gable stood tall. The heavy piece of oak hit the floor again. The sound echoed, demanding immediate silence from the stunned crowd. "That is a lie, Beatrice." The words sliced through the thick chapel air. The old woman did not use a microphone, but her voice carried a sharp clarity that reached every dark corner of the vaulted room. Mrs. Gable had lived next door to the Davis family since before Aubrey was born. She was a retired school teacher with a spine made of iron and a memory that never faded. She gripped her cane, pointing it directly at the pulpit where the grieving mother stood frozen. "You sit up there talking about leaving the porch light on," Mrs. Gable continued, her voice rising steadily above the sudden, nervous murmurs of the crowd. "You talk about waiting for a daughter to come in from the cold. I watched you throw her into it." Beatrice gripped the edges of the wooden podium. Her pale skin flushed a dark crimson beneath the harsh spotlights. "Mrs. Gable, please, sit down. You are confused. This is a time of mourning." "I'm 80 years old, not senile," Mrs. Gable replied, her tone sharp enough to cut glass. The murmurs in the pews grew louder. Aunts and uncles who had spent the last hour glaring at Aubrey now turned their confused stares toward the frail old neighbor in the third row. 10 years ago, during the worst blizzard this city had seen in a decade, I was standing at my kitchen window, Mrs. Gable said. The entire room went dead silent. The priest stepped back into the shadows, unsure how to regain control of the derailed memorial. "I watched you and Jackson drag Aubrey onto the front porch. She had no winter coat. She had a single plastic trash bag filled with everyday clothes. I watched Jackson change the deadbolts while she stood shivering on the frozen wood, crying for you to open the door. You turned off the porch light, Beatrice. You turned it off and you pulled the blinds tight." A collective gasp rippled through the congregation. The sound was visceral, a sudden intake of cold air from 200 people realizing the foundation of their sympathy was built on a calculated fabrication. The polite fiction of the grieving matriarch shattered into 1,000 jagged pieces. Aunts whispered frantically to each other. Business partners exchanged uncomfortable glances. Beatrice opened her mouth, but no sound came out. The flawless performance evaporated, leaving behind a panicked woman exposed under the unforgiving chapel lighting. Jackson stepped forward, raising his hands to placate the crowd. He tried to speak, claiming the old woman was suffering from severe dementia, but the damage was already done. The mourners began to whisper among themselves, the noise swelling into a chaotic hum. The priest rushed to the microphone and hastily announced the conclusion of the memorial service, urging everyone to proceed to the reception hall. Aubrey did not wait for the formal dismissal. She stood up from the back pew and walked out the heavy wooden double doors, leaving the chaotic theater behind. The Anchorage air hit her like a physical blow. The temperature had dropped further, freezing the moisture in her lungs with every slow breath. She walked across the vast expanse of black asphalt toward her rented SUV. The parking lot was desolate, a wide sheet of ice reflecting the flat, gray, overcast sky. Her boots crunched against the frozen gravel, the only sound in the empty space. She reached into her coat pocket for her keys. Before her fingers could brush the cold metal, heavy, frantic footsteps pounded the pavement right behind her. Aubrey turned just as Jackson lunged out from the deep shadow of a towering pine tree. He shoved her hard against the side of the rental car. The freezing metal of the door bit into her spine. The sudden impact knocked the breath from her lungs, but she kept her gaze locked directly on his face. He leaned in, trapping her against the vehicle. This was the cornered predator losing the very last remnants of his polished social exterior. His chest heaved. The bespoke suit wrinkled awkwardly around his tense shoulders. The sharp winter wind whipped his pristine haircut into a frantic mess. "You think you won?" Jackson hissed, his face inches from hers. "You think having that crazy old lady shout in a church changes anything about your situation?" Aubrey did not struggle. She analyzed the proximity with clinical precision. She registered the sour, pungent smell of cheap whiskey rolling off his breath. It was stronger now, unmasked by the subtle peppermint he tried to use earlier. His pupils were widely dilated. His hands shook with an uncontrolled tremor where they pinned her shoulders against the cold glass of the window. A wealthy, secure man does not drink bottom-shelf liquor before a public family funeral. A man in true control does not risk a physical assault in a church parking lot. Jackson was drowning in a financial panic she could not yet fully see, but could clearly smell. "Let go of me," Aubrey said, her voice a low, steady hum. Jackson pressed harder, his grip bruising her collarbone through the thick wool coat. "You are getting on the exact next flight out of Anchorage," he demanded. His speech was rapid, frantic, tumbling out in an uncoordinated, panicked rush. "If you stay here, if you try to dig into the estate affairs, I will end your life." Down in Seattle, Aubrey tilted her head, studying the raw fear in his eyes. "You do not have the reach to touch my career, Jackson." He let out a short, bitter laugh that clouded the freezing air between them. "You severely underestimate me, little sister. I have friends at the Port Authority here. Very good, very loyal friends. They helped me compile a highly interesting file over the past 3 days." He released her left shoulder just enough to reach into his inner coat pocket, pulling out a folded piece of thick cardstock. He tapped it hard against her chest. "We drafted a lovely paper trail," he said, his voice dropping into a sinister, rhythmic cadence. "It details a highly placed maritime logistics director using her corporate shipping routes to launder stolen family assets. It shows you moving vast sums of money through offshore holding companies under the guise of paying international freight tariffs." Aubrey felt a cold spike of calculation override her initial shock. He had not just prepared an angry speech, he had engineered a meticulous compliance crisis. In the high-stakes corporate logistics sector, a federal investigation into embezzlement was an immediate death sentence. Her firm would suspend her the moment they received the tip. They would freeze her corporate accounts, confiscate her security credentials, and lock her out of her own professional life before the investigation even started. He intended to strip away her armor and leave her defenseless. "It is all fake," Aubrey said, keeping her tone perfectly even. "It does not matter if it is fake," Jackson sneered, his breath hot against the frigid air. "The compliance officers at your firm will not care about the truth. They will see the official port stamps, the fabricated shipping manifests, the regulatory red flags. By the time you manage to clear your name in federal court, you will be destitute. Your career will be ashes. You will have nothing to your name. Just like that night on the porch." He stepped back, letting his hands drop to his sides. "You leave Alaska tonight, Aubrey. You never come back here. If you are still in this city by tomorrow morning, I press send on the file." Jackson turned on his heel, his expensive leather shoes slipping slightly on the treacherous black ice. He walked fast toward his imported sedan, where his wife Sarah stood shivering uncontrollably by the passenger door. Aubrey watched him retreat. She did not panic. She processed the new data points. Jackson was expending an immense amount of effort to force her out of Anchorage immediately. The urgency was the vital key. He did not just hate her presence here, he feared her physical proximity to the family records. There was a tight timeline ticking down, and her mere existence in the same city threatened to detonate his entire carefully constructed life. "Get in the car," Sarah Jackson barked, unlocking the doors with a harsh electronic beep. He slid into the driver's seat and slammed the heavy door shut, leaving his wife standing alone in the freezing wind. Sarah hesitated. She was a pale, nervous woman who always seemed to shrink into the background of the Davis family portraits. She wore a thin wool coat that offered zero protection against the harsh Alaskan winter. Her eyes darted nervously toward the tinted window of the sedan and then back toward Aubrey. For a brief second, the two women locked eyes across the icy expanse. Sarah looked terrified of her husband. Her hands trembled inside her thin leather gloves. She took a half step toward the rental SUV. The sedan engine roared to life, a loud, impatient warning from Jackson to hurry up. Sarah bit her lip hard. Instead of opening the passenger door, she reached deep into the pocket of her coat. She pulled out a thick, weather-beaten envelope. She did not throw it toward Aubrey. She simply let it slip from her trembling fingers. The heavy paper fell straight down, landing with a soft thud onto the black ice. Sarah turned and scrambled into the car. The sedan reversed sharply, tires spinning for a fraction of a second before finding solid traction. The vehicle sped out of the parking lot, leaving a thick cloud of white exhaust hanging in the frigid evening air. Aubrey stood alone in the profound silence of the empty lot. The cold seeped through the soles of her boots, but she barely registered the drop in temperature. She walked slowly toward the exact spot where Sarah had stood moments before. She knelt on the frozen asphalt and picked up the envelope. The paper was rough to the touch, frayed at the edges, hinting at secrets kept hidden in dark drawers for years. Whatever lay inside was the exact reason Jackson was unraveling, and Aubrey knew instantly it was the weapon she needed to strike back. Aubrey sat in the driver's seat of the rented SUV, leaving the engine idling. Heat poured from the dashboard vents, but she could not feel the warmth. The weather-beaten envelope rested on the passenger seat. Before she could shift the vehicle into drive, her phone vibrated against the center console. The screen lit up, casting a pale, sterile glow across the dark cabin. The notification banner displayed an urgent message from her corporate headquarters. The sender name was Richard Sterling, the Chief Executive Officer of her maritime logistics firm. Aubrey tapped the screen. The text was brief and devoid of any professional courtesy. Due to a pending federal compliance review regarding unauthorized offshore shipping routes, you are placed on immediate administrative leave. Access to all corporate portals, financial accounts, and internal communications is revoked, effective immediately. Surrender your credentials to building security upon your return to Seattle. Aubrey stared at the glowing words. She tapped the screen, navigating to her secure work application. A bright crimson banner flashed across the display reading, "Account suspended." Jackson was not bluffing. He executed the smear campaign while she was sitting in the chapel enduring her mother's eulogy. He calculated the exact time it would take for corporate risk management to panic and hit the kill switch on her career. In the high-stakes shipping sector, a rumor of embezzlement was an instant death sentence. They locked her out of the network before an investigation even began. She shifted the SUV into gear. The tires slipped on the black ice before gripping the frozen asphalt. She needed to reach her downtown hotel, secure her laptop, and formulate a counter-strategy. She navigated the dark Anchorage streets, watching the snow begin to fall in heavy, wet flakes. She pulled into the circular driveway of her hotel. A heavy-duty tow truck sat idling near the main entrance, its yellow lights rotating in the gloom. The driver stood beside the rig, tapping a rugged tablet. He looked up, checking the license plate of her rental car. He walked toward her window and signaled for her to roll down the glass. Ma'am, the rental agency reported this vehicle flagged for immediate repossession due to payment failure. The driver said his tone was bored. He dealt with stranded tourists every day. Aubrey did not argue. Payment failure meant Jackson was moving faster than she anticipated. She grabbed her leather tote bag and the envelope from the passenger seat. She left the keys in the ignition, stepped out into the freezing air, and walked toward the sliding glass doors of the lobby. The warm air inside hit her face, creating a stark contrast to the dropping temperature outside. The lobby smelled of expensive cedar and roasted coffee. She approached the mahogany front desk. The night manager stood behind the counter, his expression tight and uncomfortable. "Miss Davis, the card on file for your room deposit declined 10 minutes ago," he said, keeping his voice low to avoid alerting the other guests. "We need an alternative payment method to keep your reservation active." Aubrey reached into her wallet and pulled out her personal checking card. She slid the plastic across the smooth wood counter. The manager swiped it through the terminal. A harsh beep sounded. Declined. She pulled out her phone and opened her private banking application. The login screen spun for 2 agonizing seconds before loading. Another crimson banner stretched across the top of her screen. "Suspicious activity detected. Funds frozen pending investigation. Please contact your local branch." Jackson did not just rely on Port Authority rumors. He used his country club connections with local regional bank executives. He orchestrated a synchronized financial blackout. He stripped away her income, her transportation, and her shelter in a single coordinated strike. He wanted her terrified. He wanted her to beg for a flight out of town. "I am sorry, Miss Davis," the manager said, sliding the plastic card back across the mahogany surface. "We have to ask you to vacate the premises. We will hold your luggage in the secure storage room until the balance is settled." Aubrey turned away from the desk. She walked back through the sliding glass doors, stepping out into the unforgiving Alaskan night. The snowfall had intensified, transforming the city streets into a white blur. The temperature plunged below zero. The wind howled off the inlet, carrying sharp crystals of ice that stung her cheeks and forehead. She stood under the hotel awning, calculating her options. She had 3 $20 bills in her coat pocket. That was not enough for a cab in this weather, even if one was available. Her phone battery showed 12%. She was locked out of the digital world and stranded in the physical one. The only safe harbor she knew was 3 miles away in her old residential district. She pulled the collar of her wool coat high around her neck. She clutched the tote bag tightly against her side, shielding the weathered envelope from the dampness. She stepped off the curb and began to walk. The sidewalks were buried under fresh powder, making every single step a grueling physical effort. Her boots crunched through the thick crust of ice. The cold began its slow, insidious creep, starting at her toes and working its way up her calves. Her lungs burned with each intake of frigid air. The wind cut through the thick wool fabric, stealing her core heat. Anchorage streets grew desolate as the blizzard worsened. Streetlights flickered, casting long, distorted shadows across the massive snowdrifts. She focused on putting one foot in front of the other, maintaining a rigid, mechanical rhythm. The physical isolation and the freezing air triggered something deep within her memory. The sound of her boots breaking the ice morphed into a different sound, a sharp, metallic click. It was the heavy brass deadbolt sliding into place 10 years ago. She heard the wind howling around the porch columns the night her parents threw her out. Through the haze of the current snowstorm, she heard her mother's voice speaking through the frost-covered glass of the front door. "You brought this on yourself, Aubrey. Do not knock again. We will not open this door." She remembered standing on the wooden planks, shivering in a thin sweater, holding a plastic trash bag full of clothes. She remembered the profound terror of realizing the people who were supposed to protect her had locked her out to die in the cold. The memory did not break her. It fueled her. The shivering in her limbs stopped. A profound, radiating heat bloomed in her chest, born of pure, focused adrenaline. 10 years ago, she was a terrified girl begging for shelter. Today, she was a logistics expert, trained to navigate disasters and rebuild broken supply chains. Jackson and Beatrice thought freezing her out would force a surrender. They assumed stripping away her modern conveniences would render her helpless. As the familiar outline of the old residential neighborhood materialized through the swirling snow, Aubrey felt her defensive posture melt away. She was no longer trying to protect her career or her reputation. Those were superficial casualties. She shifted into a state of ruthless predation. She was going to dismantle their entire existence. She was going to tear down the empire they built on her stolen life. She trudged up the familiar shoveled walkway of the small house next to her childhood home. A warm yellow light glowed from the front window. She stood on the covered porch, stamping the heavy snow from her boots. Her fingers were completely numb, but she maintained a death grip on the leather tote bag. Before she raised her hand to knock on the wooden door, Aubrey unzipped the bag. She pulled out the weather-beaten envelope Sarah had dropped on the ice. The paper was stiff from the cold. Jackson had destroyed her life today to keep this exact envelope sealed. He burned down her corporate world to prevent her from seeing what was inside. Aubrey slid her frozen thumb under the flap and ripped the seal open. The heavy oak door swung open before she could lift her freezing knuckles to knock. Mrs. Gable stood in the entryway wearing a thick, quilted robe. Warm yellow light spilled out onto the frosted porch, illuminating the chaotic, swirling snow. The old woman did not ask questions. She reached out with a surprisingly strong grip, grabbed the sleeve of Aubrey's wool coat, and pulled her inside. The heavy door clicked shut instantly, silencing the deafening howl of the Alaskan wind. The transition from the lethal blizzard to the quiet warmth of the living room felt disorienting. A fire crackled in the brick hearth, radiating intense heat against Aubrey's chilled skin. The house smelled of old paper chamomile tea and burning cedar. Mrs. Gable pointed a stern finger toward an overstuffed floral armchair near the fire. "Sit down before you lose a toe," the old woman commanded. She turned toward the kitchen, her slippers shuffling against the polished hardwood floor. "I will make tea. Do not move until the shivering stops." Aubrey sank into the patterned fabric. Her muscles began to thaw, sending sharp, agonizing pins and needles radiating through her arms and legs. She ignored the physical pain. Her eyes remained locked on the weather-beaten envelope she had torn open seconds ago on the porch. She pulled the thick stack of folded papers from inside the damp casing, holding them near the firelight to read. The top document was yellowed at the edges, stiff and fragile with age. The header bore the embossed logo of a prominent Anchorage medical laboratory. The date, typed in faded black ink, read October 4th, 1992. Aubrey traced the raised seal with her numb thumb. It was a certified paternity test. She read the sterile clinical lines. The probability of paternity for the man she had called her father her entire childhood was listed as 0%. Aubrey stared at the printed numbers. The man who sat at the head of the dinner table, the man who looked right through her for 2 decades, the man who stood by silently while Beatrice locked her out in the snow, was not her blood relative. Her real father was listed 1 line below in stark black text, Elias Cross. The name hit her like a physical blow. Elias Cross was the wealthy, silent partner in the original Davis family shipping business. He was the man who provided the foundational capital to build the empire her brother now ran into the ground. He was a phantom figure in her childhood, rarely seen, but always referenced in hushed, deferential tones by her mother. He drove expensive cars, wore immaculate suits, and always watched Aubrey with a strange, silent intensity during his rare visits to the estate. And he was the original owner of the vintage emerald brooch Beatrice paraded at the funeral hours ago. The pieces of her fractured childhood abruptly snapped into a terrifying, coherent picture. Beatrice resented her because she was walking, living proof of an infidelity. The man who raised her tolerated her out of sheer financial dependence on Elias Cross. They treated her like a burden because to them, she was a walking liability, a constant reminder of a secret deal. But the hatred alone did not explain the calculated eviction 10 years ago. Disdain does not require a midnight lockout in a blizzard. Hatred does not require a coordinated smear campaign. Aubrey set the paternity test on her lap and unfolded the second document. The paper was thicker, modern, and bound with a heavy blue legal backing. It was a highly classified trust mandate drawn up by a private wealth management syndicate in Seattle. Elias Cross had established a blind trust designating Aubrey as the sole beneficiary of his entire fortune, including the controlling shares of the shipping empire. The trust transferred upon his death, which aligned perfectly with the exact month Aubrey turned 24. The exact same month, Beatrice and Jackson dragged her onto the porch and changed the locks. They did not kick her out because she was rebellious or difficult. They discarded her to eliminate the sole heir. Jackson needed her physically gone to forge a narrative of abandonment, allowing him to seize control of the vast assets under a fraudulent proxy. The cruelty was never just emotional. It was an intricate corporate heist masked as a family dispute. Mrs. Gable returned holding a steaming mug of tea. She handed the ceramic cup to Aubrey, taking a seat in the rocking chair opposite the fire. The old woman looked at the scattered papers but said nothing, offering a respectful, knowing silence. She had lived next door for 30 years. She had seen the whispers, the strange visits, the midnight arguments. Aubrey took a sip of the scalding liquid, letting the heat steady her core. She turned to the third and final page of the legal mandate. The text here shifted from standard asset distribution to highly specific contingency clauses. Her eyes scanned the dense legal paragraphs, stopping at a section labeled Default Allocation. It was a poison pill clause. Elias Cross had been a paranoid, ruthless businessman who distrusted the Davis family. He built a self-destruct mechanism into the financial architecture to protect his daughter. The clause stipulated that the beneficiary, Aubrey, had to physically present herself at the syndicate headquarters to claim the trust. If she remained missing, estranged, or failed to claim the assets exactly 10 years after her 24th birthday, the trust would automatically dissolve. Every single dollar, every stock, every corporate share would instantly route into an irrevocable, locked, charitable escrow. Aubrey felt her pulse drum in her ears. She ran the mental calculations. She turned 24 a decade ago this very month. She checked the specific date listed in the mandate. The 10-year window expired in exactly 7 days. The realization was profound, altering the entire landscape of her current situation. Jackson was not just greedy, he was drowning in sheer panic. He had been living on borrowed time, managing an empire he could never fully liquidate without her signature. He likely secured enormous high-interest bridge loans against the illusion of his wealth. Now the clock was expiring. In 7 days, the automatic transfer would trigger stripping him of everything. His country club memberships, his imported sedans, his luxury properties would vanish overnight, leaving him exposed to creditors. He orchestrated the compliance crisis to force her out of the state because her mere physical presence in Alaska threatened to expose the ticking time bomb. If she stayed and hired a lawyer, the trust would be frozen and his loans would default. He needed her disgraced and running for Seattle. The psychological weight of her entire existence being reduced to a financial deadline settled over her. Her family had spent 10 years smiling for holiday photos, playing the victims while holding a knife to her throat. They banked their entire future on the assumption that she would stay broken, terrified, and far away. They built their entire social standing on the premise of her supposed insanity. The warmth of the fire no longer registered on her skin. The shivering in her extremities ceased entirely. Survival was a concept for the weak. She was no longer trying to endure their attacks or salvage her logistics career. Those were defensive moves. The revelation crystallized her focus, transforming her defensive posture into cold, tactical predation. They stole her history, her inheritance, and her safety. The calculated destruction of their empire was the only logical path forward. Aubrey folded the documents, placing them carefully back into the weather-beaten envelope. She set the mug of tea on the small wooden side table. She looked across the hearth at Mrs. Gable. "Do you still have a landline?" Aubrey asked. Her voice held no trace of fear or cold, just the flat, metallic tone of a commander preparing a battlefield. Mrs. Gable nodded slowly, pointing toward a heavy rotary phone sitting on a polished oak credenza in the hallway. "I keep it for emergencies," she replied, her eyes sharp and assessing. She recognized the look on Aubrey's face. It was the same look Elias Cross used to wear when he visited the neighborhood. Aubrey stood up. Her joints ached from the freezing trek, but her mind operated with pristine clarity. She needed inside intelligence on Jackson's current financial vulnerability. She needed to know exactly how much debt he carried and where the structural flaws in his operation were hidden. There was only one person who had that data and the motivation to share it: the woman who dropped the envelope on the ice, Sarah. She walked into the dimly lit hallway and picked up the heavy receiver. The plastic was cool against her ear. She dialed the number scribbled in faint pencil on the back flap of the envelope. The phone rang 3 times before a breathless, terrified voice answered on the other end. Sarah, Aubrey said, staring at her own reflection in the hallway mirror. Her eyes were dark, resolute, and unblinking. "You gave me the problem. Now you are going to give me the blueprints to tear it all down." Aubrey paused, letting the weight of her words sink in over the crackling phone line. "Meet me at the diner on Highway 1 in 2 hours. Come alone, or I hand this envelope to the federal authorities tonight." Aubrey parked the rusted pickup truck near a towering snowdrift. The heater core had failed 3 miles ago, leaving the cabin freezing cold. She grabbed her leather tote bag and pushed the heavy metal door open. The wind howled, tearing across the desolate highway. She walked toward the neon sign of the diner. The red light flickered, casting long, distorted shadows across the icy pavement. Inside the diner, the air smelled of stale fryer grease and dark roast coffee. A tarnished bell jingled, announcing her arrival. The waitress, a tired woman holding a glass pot, did not look up. Aubrey chose a booth in the far back corner facing the entrance. She slid onto the cracked vinyl seat and unzipped her bag. She pulled out her secure corporate laptop, setting it on the scratched laminate table. She checked her watch. Sarah was late. The glass door swung open, letting in a swirl of white snow. Sarah stepped over the threshold. Her thin wool coat was soaked through, clinging to her narrow shoulders. She looked around the brightly lit room, her eyes wide with unmasked panic. For 10 years, Sarah played the role of the quiet, obedient wife. She stood in the background of family photos wearing the expensive jewelry Jackson bought to project his fabricated success. She never questioned the narrative Beatrice spun. She simply enjoyed the spoils of their stolen empire in compliant silence. Seeing her now stripped of that polished veneer, Aubrey recognized the raw desperation of a cornered animal. Sarah spotted Aubrey and hurried toward the corner booth. Her boots left wet, muddy tracks on the scuffed linoleum floor. She slid into the opposite side of the table, keeping her hands buried deep in her coat pockets. She did not take off her damp outer layers. Her gaze darted toward the window, watching the dark highway for any sign of headlights. "You are shivering," Aubrey said, her tone flat and devoid of sympathy. She signaled the waitress. 2 black coffees. Leave the pot." Sarah flinched at the sound of Aubrey's voice. "I do not have much time," she whispered, leaning across the sticky table. "Jackson thinks I am asleep in the guest room. If he wakes up and finds my car gone, he will know I betrayed him. A man in control does not stage a physical assault in a church parking lot," Aubrey noted, watching the dark liquid pour into the thick ceramic mugs. "He is unraveling." "He is terrified," Sarah corrected her, voice trembling over the rim of the steaming mug. "He has not slept a full night in 3 months. He paces the hallways downstairs. He takes phone calls at 3 in the morning, speaking in frantic, hushed tones. He thinks I do not hear him, but I hear everything. I see the bank notices he tries to intercept in the mail. I see the final demands from the creditors." Aubrey rested her hands on the table, letting the warmth from the coffee seep into her chilled skin. "And yet, he drives an imported sedan and wears custom suits." "It is a stage play," Sarah said, her breath hitching. "A front to keep the bankers at bay. He is planning to run Aubrey. I found a hidden travel bag in the trunk of his car yesterday. I found a passport application expedited under a different name. He intends to drain whatever liquid cash remains in the operating accounts and board a flight before the end of the week. He is going to leave me here to face the debt collectors and the lawyers alone. I will be left with nothing. Sarah pulled her hands out of her pockets. Her cuticles were bitten raw, bleeding slightly at the edges. She reached into her coat and pulled out a small silver flash drive. She placed it on the table between them, keeping her trembling fingertips pressed firmly against the metal casing. These are the internal ledgers, Sarah said, her eyes locking onto Aubrey. Every shell company, every offshore holding, every bank transaction from the last decade. It took me 6 weeks to copy them from his home office server. I want a deal. Aubrey stared at the silver drive. Then she looked up at Sarah, evaluating the sudden shift in posture. You want a severance package for betraying your husband. I want to survive, Sarah countered, a flash of defiant instinct hardening her pale features. You are going to take the estate back. I know that. He knows that. When the dust settles, I want 10% of the recovered liquid assets. In exchange, I hand you the blueprints to his destruction. Aubrey analyzed the woman sitting across from her. Sarah was not motivated by guilt or a sudden moral awakening. She was driven by pure self-preservation. It was a transactional loyalty, which made it highly reliable in this specific context. She needed this data, but she would not relinquish control of the negotiation. I agree to 5%, Aubrey said, her tone leaving zero room for debate. And you walk away with your freedom. Sarah swallowed hard. She slowly pulled her fingers back, sliding the silver drive across the scratched table. Aubrey picked it up. The metal felt warm from resting inside the coat pocket. Aubrey opened her laptop. The screen glowed to life, demanding a biometric scan. She pressed her thumb to the sensor, unlocking the encrypted desktop. She inserted the flash drive into the side port. A small green light on the drive began to blink rapidly. Aubrey opened the file directory. Instead of a list of spreadsheets, a stark black terminal window abruptly popped up on her screen. Lines of white code began scrolling at a dizzying speed. A red warning banner flashed across the top of the interface, displaying a stark message. Unauthorized encryption protocol detected. Proceed with decryption. Aubrey froze, her hand hovering inches above the keyboard. The tension in the booth spiked. She looked sharply at Sarah. What is this? Sarah shrank back against the vinyl seat, raising her hands defensively. I do not know. I just copied the folders he kept in the secure partition. I swear to you, I did not alter them. Aubrey stared at the blinking green light. Her mind raced through the tactical possibilities. This could be a brilliant, lethal trap. Jackson could have anticipated his wife turning on him. He might have planted spyware on the drive, designed to infiltrate Aubrey's secure laptop, wipe her existing professional files, or transmit her exact location back to his phone. If she pressed enter, she risked exposing her only secure device to a hostile digital attack. The green light pulsed a steady, rhythmic warning. Aubrey analyzed the code scrolling in the background. It was a sophisticated cipher, standard for high-level financial data masking. If Jackson wanted to destroy her laptop, he would have used a silent executable file, not a prompted decryption sequence. He was hiding the truth behind a digital padlock, because the truth was his ultimate vulnerability. She pressed the enter key. A loading bar appeared on the screen. The progress crawled. 2%. 5%. The silence in the diner stretched tight enough to snap. The only sounds were the hum of the neon sign outside and the rhythmic tap of Aubrey's fingernail against her coffee mug. 12%. She watched Sarah, who looked genuinely nauseated, her eyes fixed on the crawling blue bar. 80%. 95%. The terminal window vanished. A clean, organized directory of financial folders populated the screen. Aubrey let out a slow, measured breath. The trap was a phantom. The ledgers were genuine. She opened the master spreadsheet. As a maritime logistics director, Aubrey spent her life reading complex data matrices, charting fuel costs against freight tariffs, and calculating profit margins down to the decimal. Reading Jackson's financial map was effortless. She scrolled through columns of red ink and cascading debt structures. The optical illusion of the Davis family wealth dissolved right before her eyes. Beatrice and Jackson were broke. The core assets of the blind trust were locked in blue-chip investments and highly conservative municipal bonds. The capital was immense, but it was strictly illiquid. Without Aubrey's physical signature to authorize a broad sell-off, Jackson could not touch the principal fortune. To fund his custom suits, the imported sedans, and Beatrice's luxury shopping habits, he had been taking out high-interest bridge loans from private banking syndicates. He used the optical illusion of controlling the trust as collateral. He showed the bankers the paperwork proving he was the proxy, displaying the vast wealth sitting in the untouchable accounts. The banks extended him credit lines based on that phantom authority. But the interest rates were predatory, and the operational costs of the failing shipping business were draining his cash flow faster than he could replenish it. He was shifting money from one shell company to another just to cover the minimum monthly interest payments. Aubrey scrolled to the final tab. Her eyes locked onto a staggering number in the bottom right corner. A balloon payment on the primary bridge loan. It was due in exactly 5 days. 2 days before the poison pill clause triggered the final, irrevocable transfer of the trust. Jackson was caught in a lethal financial vice. He did not have the cash to make the balloon payment. If he defaulted, the banking syndicate would seize his personal assets. If he tried to access the trust, the poison pill would detonate. He was a dead man walking. "If I prove the trust ownership is currently contested," Aubrey murmured, her eyes tracking the cascading debt, "the banking syndicate will instantly freeze his credit lines to mitigate their risk. They will issue an immediate margin call." "He will lose the house," Sarah whispered. "He will lose everything by Friday." Aubrey closed the laptop, her expression hardening into a mask of pure tactical resolve. Crashing his credit was the kill shot. But to trigger the bank freeze, she needed undeniable proof that his proxy control was fraudulent. The financial ledgers were not enough to contest the title. She needed to expose the exact legal mechanism he used to steal her identity 10 years ago. She reopened the laptop and cross-referenced the outbound wire transfers. She noticed a recurring monthly payment to a dummy corporation titled Matanuska Medical Consulting. The routing numbers traced back to a private clinic deep in the valley. The stipends started exactly 10 years ago, the same month she was thrown into the snow. It was hush money. Jackson was paying a corrupt psychiatrist to maintain the fraudulent diagnosis that kept Aubrey legally incapacitated. The doctor's name was Eris Thorne. If she could break Thorne, she would possess the ultimate weapon to sever Jackson's financial lifeline. She packed the laptop back into her leather tote bag. The diner lights buzzed overhead, casting a harsh glare on the empty coffee mugs. Aubrey slid out of the booth, leaving Sarah sitting alone with her trembling hands. The storm outside was intensifying, but Aubrey welcomed the cold. She had a destination now, and she was going to hunt the doctor down. Aubrey parked a rusted pickup truck in the driveway of the quiet residential neighborhood. The engine ticked as it cooled down, fighting against the plunging temperature. Aubrey grabbed her leather tote bag and hurried up the shoveled pathway. The porch light remained on a steady yellow beacon in the swirling white storm. Mrs. Gable opened the door before Aubrey reached the top step. The old woman held a thick wool blanket, handing it over wordlessly. Aubrey walked straight to the living room, taking a seat on the woven rug next to the crackling fire. She pulled her laptop from the bag and placed it on the floor. Mrs. Gable sat in her rocking chair, watching closely. Aubrey asked for the neighborhood records the old woman mentioned earlier. Mrs. Gable retrieved a heavy iron lockbox from the hallway closet, setting it gently beside the laptop. Inside were dozens of leather-bound journals filled with neat, cursive handwriting. For 3 decades, the retired schoolteacher had documented every unusual vehicle, every strange visitor, and every midnight argument that occurred next door. Aubrey cross-referenced the digital ledgers from Sarah with the physical journals. She navigated to the recurring monthly payments sent to Matanuska Medical Consulting. The digital trail started exactly 1 decade ago during the second week of January. Aubrey opened Mrs. Gable's journal from that exact year. She scanned the handwritten entries, tracing her finger down the faded lines. January 10th. A silver sedan parked in the Davis driveway, license plate recorded. The driver carried a black leather medical bag. January 12th. The same vehicle returned. January 14th, the night of the blizzard. Aubrey flipped to a folded piece of paper tucked between the journal pages. It was a crumpled carbon copy of a medical slip. Mrs. Gable explained she found it blowing across her front lawn the morning after the blizzard. The slip bore a distinctive, sharp signature at the bottom, Dr. Elias Thorne. The mechanical structure of the theft became crystal clear. A highly secured blind trust could never be hijacked by a simple backdated notary stamp or a forged signature. Corporate wealth management syndicates required rigorous legal authorization to transfer proxy control. Jackson needed a federal judge to sign off on a conservatorship. To get that signature, he needed a medical professional to declare Aubrey legally incapacitated. The story Beatrice spun for the extended family was not just a bid for sympathy. The narrative of the reckless daughter wandering into the frozen wilderness, abandoning her parents, was the social cover for a devastating legal fiction. Jackson paid Dr. Thorne to write a fraudulent psychiatric evaluation. They claimed Aubrey suffered a severe psychotic break, rendering her a danger to herself and entirely incapable of managing her own affairs. They filed the paperwork in absentia, claiming she fled the state before she could be committed. The court granted Jackson full medical and financial power of attorney. Aubrey stared at the flickering flames in the hearth. Her brother did not just steal her money, he legally erased her autonomy. He bought a doctor to certify her as insane. She memorized the address listed for Matanuska Medical Consulting. She closed the laptop and placed the crumpled carbon copy in her coat pocket. The clock on the mantel chimed 6 in the morning. The sun would not rise for another 4 hours, but the storm was finally breaking. The heavy snowfall transitioned into a light, freezing drizzle. Aubrey stood up, thanking Mrs. Gable for the sanctuary. She walked back out to the rusted truck. The drive into the Matanuska Valley was treacherous. The highway wound through jagged mountain passes and dense frozen pine forests. The landscape felt desolate, mirroring the decaying career of the man she was hunting. Elias Thorne once treated the Anchorage elite, but his practice had crumbled over the years. The dummy corporation payouts from Jackson were likely the only income keeping his doors open. Aubrey navigated the truck down a poorly plowed secondary road. She pulled into a small gravel parking lot. The clinic was a single-story, cinder-block building with a flat roof. The paint peeled off the exterior walls in long, brittle strips. A faded plastic sign hung above the entrance reading, Matanuska Behavioral Health. There were no other cars in the lot. She turned off the ignition and stepped out. The freezing air stung her lungs. She walked toward the glass entrance. The door chimed weakly as she pushed it open. The waiting room was empty. The air inside smelled of harsh chemical bleach, masking a deeper scent of damp rot. Fluorescent lights buzzed loudly overhead, casting a sickly pale glow across the stained ceiling tiles. Rows of cheap plastic chairs sat unoccupied, facing a blank television screen. A sliding glass reception window sat closed. Aubrey bypassed the desk and walked straight down the narrow hallway. She did not bother to announce herself. She operated with the cold, unyielding precision of a systems architect identifying a critical structural failure. She reached the last door on the right, which stood slightly ajar. Dr. Thorne sat behind a cluttered laminate desk. He looked older than the signature in the journal suggested. His graying hair was unkempt, and his posture slumped under the weight of an unseen burden. He wore a wrinkled button-down shirt without a tie. He stared at a stack of unpaid utility bills, resting his forehead in his left hand. Aubrey pushed the door fully open. The hinges whined, breaking the silence. Thorne looked up startled. His eyes were bloodshot, and dark circles bruised the fragile skin beneath them. "The clinic is closed," he said, his voice raspy and defensive. "You need to call the front desk to schedule an appointment." Aubrey stepped into the office, letting the door click shut behind her. I am not here for a consultation, Dr. Thorne. She walked toward his desk. Her gaze swept the cluttered surface, noting the pharmaceutical promotional pens, the overflowing ashtray, and a fresh prescription pad resting near his right hand. The pad bore the exact same distinctive sharp signature printed at the top. The visual confirmation locked the final piece of the puzzle into place. Thorne frowned, gripping the edge of his desk. "Who are you?" Aubrey stopped 2 feet away from him. She stood tall, projecting an aura of absolute, clinical dominance. "My name is Aubrey Davis." The color drained from Thorne's face instantly. His mouth opened, but his vocal cords failed to produce a sound. His right hand began to tremble, a fine, uncontrollable shake that rattled the pens on his desk. He recognized the name immediately. It was the name of the ghost he helped bury 10 years ago. "You are supposed to be out of state," he whispered, staring at her as if she were an apparition. "I am standing right in front of you," Aubrey replied, her tone even and devoid of screaming rage. "And as you can see, my cognitive faculties are perfectly intact. I have not suffered a psychotic break. I am not wandering the wilderness. I am currently holding a position as a maritime logistics director, managing international supply chains." Thorne pushed his chair back, the casters grinding against the cheap linoleum floor. "I do not know what you are talking about. You need to leave my office right now, or I will call the local police." Aubrey did not flinch. "Call them," she challenged, gesturing toward the dusty telephone sitting on his desk. "Tell them the woman you diagnosed with severe psychosis in absentia a decade ago is standing in your office. Tell them you need protection from the patient you fraudulently committed so Jackson Davis could hijack the Elias Cross Blind Trust." Thorne's trembling worsened. He pulled his hand away from the desk, hiding it in his lap. "Jackson assured me you would never return." "Jackson is a cornered animal, drowning in predatory bridge loans," Aubrey stated, dealing the facts like cards on a table. "The illusion of his wealth is collapsing. The balloon payment on his primary credit line is due in 5 days, and he does not have the liquid capital to cover it. The monthly hush money he wires to your dummy corporation will cease by Friday. When the banking syndicate seizes his assets, your fake consulting firm will be the first anomaly the forensic accountants investigate." She leaned forward, resting her palms flat on the edge of his desk. She invaded his personal space, forcing him to confront the reality of his impending ruin. "You tied your medical license to a sinking ship," Aubrey continued, her voice dropping to a low, steady hum. "Federal investigators will trace the fraudulent conservatorship back to your signature. They will audit your current practice. They will find every corner you cut to keep these lights on. You are looking at a minimum of 15 years in federal prison for medical fraud and conspiracy to commit wire fraud." Thorne squeezed his eyes shut. A bead of sweat rolled down his pale temple. "What do you want from me?" "I do not want an apology," Aubrey said, watching the sheer terror dismantle his defenses. "I want the original, unaltered medical files you kept as leverage. And I want a sworn, written affidavit detailing exactly how much Jackson paid you to forge my incapacitation." Thorne opened his eyes, looking up at her with raw desperation. "If I give you that, Jackson will ruin me." Aubrey stood up straight, restoring her cold, imposing posture. "Jackson has nothing left to threaten you with. I am the incoming storm, Dr. Thorne. You can either hand me the evidence I need to break him, or you can drown alongside him when the flood hits. The choice is yours, but you have exactly 60 seconds to make it." Thorne stared at the prescription pad on his desk. The room was suffocatingly quiet, save for the ticking of a cheap plastic wall clock. He knew she held every card. The ghost had returned, not to haunt them, but to execute a flawless, systematic dismantling of everything they built in the dark. The plastic wall clock ticked loudly, echoing in the sterile silence of the clinic office. The red second hand swept across the faded white dial, marking the remaining time. Thorne stared at the prescription pad, his breathing shallow and erratic. Aubrey did not break eye contact. She remained perfectly still, a monolith of calculated pressure standing over his desk. 15 seconds, Aubrey said, her voice cutting through the hum of the overhead fluorescent bulbs. Thorne swallowed hard, his throat bobbing against his wrinkled collar. You do not understand the reach your brother has. He has judges in his pocket. He has board members who look the other way. If I cross him, he will ensure I never practice medicine again, anywhere in this country. Aubrey reached into her leather tote bag and pulled out her laptop. She placed the device directly on top of his scattered, unpaid utility bills. She pressed her thumb to the sensor, bringing the screen to life. The financial ledgers glowed in the dim room, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the stale air. She spun the laptop around so the screen faced the defeated doctor. Read the numbers, Dr. Thorne, Aubrey instructed, pointing a steady finger at the cascading red columns. Jackson does not own judges. He rents them, using predatory credit lines he can no longer afford to pay back. Look at the balloon payment due on Friday. Look at the empty cash reserves. Your monthly retainer originates from a shell company that is currently overdrawn by $200,000. The man you are terrified of is financially dead. The moment the banking syndicate audits his accounts, his entire network of purchased loyalty evaporates. Thorne leaned closer to the screen. The pale light reflected in his bloodshot eyes as he scanned the catastrophic balance sheets. The fine tremor in his right hand migrated up his arm, settling into a deep, visible shudder in his shoulders. Aubrey pressed her advantage, outlining the precise legal mechanics of his impending downfall. She did not raise her voice. She delivered the facts with lethal bureaucratic efficiency. Title 18, United States Code, Section 1343, Aubrey recited, her tone sharp and precise. Conspiracy to commit wire fraud. Add to that the state charges for medical malpractice, falsifying clinical records, and perjury. When the federal marshals raid this clinic, they will not care about your fear of Jackson Davis. They will seize your hard drives, audit your dummy corporation, and offer you a plea deal only if you provide the architect of the fraud. If I leave this office without the files, I will drive straight to the Federal Bureau of Investigation field office in Anchorage. You will be indicted before the weekend. Thorne tore his gaze away from the laptop screen. He looked up at Aubrey, his defenses entirely dismantled. He was a man who had traded his professional oath for a steady paycheck, and the realization that the checks were bouncing finally broke him. He slumped back into his cheap office chair, the vinyl groaning under his weight. He ran a shaking hand through his unkempt gray hair, letting out a long, ragged sigh. He paid me $50,000 up front, Thorne whispered, his voice thick with defeat. He brought the conservatorship paperwork to my house the night of the blizzard. He told me you were erratic, suffering from severe delusions, and refusing treatment. He said it was a private family matter, an emergency intervention to protect the shipping estate from your supposed manic episodes. Aubrey felt a cold knot tighten in her chest, but she maintained her clinical exterior. And you signed the evaluation without ever examining the patient. I needed the money. Thorne confessed, staring at the scuffed linoleum floor. The clinic was facing foreclosure. Jackson offered to clear my debts and put me on a monthly retainer for medical consulting. All I had to do was certify that your condition rendered you legally incapacitated. He handled the judge. He filed the proxy documents. I just provided the medical cover story. He looked back up at her, a flicker of desperate self-preservation lighting his tired eyes. But I am not a fool, Miss Davis. I knew dealing with your brother was dangerous. I knew he would eventually look for a scapegoat if the fraud ever surfaced. I needed leverage, an insurance policy to ensure he kept paying my retainer. Thorne pushed his chair away from the desk. He stood up slowly, his joints popping in the quiet room. He walked toward a heavy metal filing cabinet tucked into the far corner of the office. He pulled a small silver key from his trouser pocket and inserted it into the locking mechanism. The metal tumblers clicked. He opened the bottom drawer and reached far into the back, pulling out a thick, heavy manila envelope. He carried the package back to the desk. His hand trembled as he extended the envelope toward Aubrey. The thick brown paper was sealed with a strip of clear tape, untouched, for 10 years. Take it, Thorne said, his breathing ragged. It is all in there. Aubrey accepted the envelope. The weight of the paper felt substantial in her grasp. She broke the tape with her thumb and pulled out the contents. The first stack of papers consisted of her genuine, unaltered psychological evaluations from a routine company health screening months before her eviction. The documents certified her in perfect mental health, signed and dated by an independent corporate physician. It was the undeniable proof of her sanity, contradicting every single claim Jackson filed with the court. Beneath the health records lay an even more vital document. It was a crisp, notarized copy of the original blind trust mandate, signed by Elias Cross. Attached to the mandate was a sworn affidavit drafted by Thorne himself, detailing the exact dates, amounts, and methods Jackson used to bribe him. The doctor had documented his own crime meticulously, ensuring he could take Jackson down if the payments ever stopped. This affidavit guarantees your immunity only if you cooperate fully when the federal investigators contact you. Aubrey stated, sliding the documents back into the manila envelope, "If you attempt to warn Jackson or destroy any digital records on your servers, I will ensure the prosecutors seek the maximum penalty." "I will not warn him," Thorne muttered, sinking back into his chair. "He is a sinking ship, just like you said. I want no part of his drowning." Aubrey placed the manila envelope into her leather tote bag, resting it securely next to her laptop. She zipped the bag closed. She possessed the weapon needed to execute her endgame. The undeniable legal counterstrike was secured. She had the proof of the medical forgery, the genuine trust mandate, and the financial ledgers exposing the fraudulent bridge loans. The complex machinery of her brother's stolen empire was now entirely under her control. She turned her back on the broken doctor and walked toward the office door. The air in the hallway still smelled of chemical bleach and damp rot, but it no longer felt suffocating. Aubrey pushed through the glass entrance, stepping out into the freezing Matanuska Valley morning. The light freezing drizzle had stopped. The sky above the jagged mountain peaks began to lighten, shifting from deep charcoal to a bruised purple twilight. She walked toward the rusted pickup truck, her boots crunching against the fresh layer of ice. The cold wind bit at her face, but a profound sense of tactical momentum kept her warm. She opened the heavy metal door and slid onto the frozen bench seat. She tossed the leather tote bag onto the passenger side and inserted the brass keys into the ignition. The engine sputtered, protesting the cold, before roaring to life with a loud mechanical rattle. Before she could shift the truck into gear, a sharp ringing sound pierced the cabin. Aubrey paused, her hand resting on the gear shift. She reached into her coat pocket and pulled out the prepaid burner phone she purchased at a gas station hours ago. Only one person had the number. She pressed the green button and held the device to her ear. "Aubrey," the voice on the other end was a frantic, terrified whisper. It was Sarah. "Speak clearly," Aubrey instructed, her eyes scanning the empty gravel parking lot. "He knows." Sarah gasped, her voice trembling with raw panic. Jackson went into his home office to authorize a wire transfer. He found the secure server partition unlocked. He realized the financial ledgers were copied. He is tearing the study apart right now, throwing furniture, smashing the display cabinets. He accused Beatrice of leaving the safe open. They are screaming at each other. Aubrey listened to the chaos filtering through the phone connection. The sound of breaking glass echoed faintly in the background, followed by Jackson's enraged shouting. "He knows someone took the blueprints." Sarah continued, her breath hitching in her throat. "And he knows his passport application is missing from the trunk. He is locking down the estate, Aubrey. He called his private security contractors. He told them to find me. You need to act now before he moves the remaining liquid assets offshore." The internal fracture of the Davis family had officially begun. The paranoia Jackson carefully suppressed for a decade was now detonating inside his own home, turning him against his mother and sending his wife into hiding. The timeline just accelerated, from days down to hours. "Stay out of sight," Aubrey commanded, shifting the truck into drive. "Do not go to the police yet. I am triggering the bank freeze the moment they open for business." She ended the call and tossed the burner phone onto the dashboard. The rusted truck lurched forward, its chained tires biting into the icy road. The villain's empire was crumbling from the inside, and Aubrey was driving straight back into the city to deliver the final lethal blow. The storm raging across Anchorage battered the reinforced windows of the Davis estate, but the true epicenter of the destruction was isolated inside the grand family study. The expansive room smelled of stale cigar smoke, aged leather, and raw fear. Jackson stood behind the heavy mahogany desk. His bespoke suit jacket lay discarded on the floor, pooling like a dark shadow. His expensive dress shirt clung to his back, stained with nervous sweat. He stared at the glowing monitor of his desktop computer. A stark white email notification glared back at him. It was an urgent communication from his primary private banking syndicate, issuing a 7-figure margin call. The demand required immediate liquid collateral by the close of business today. He gripped the edges of the desk, his knuckles turning white. The bridge loan was collapsing. The realization that the secure server partition had been accessed hours earlier pounded in his skull like a war drum. Someone had bypassed the encryption. Someone had downloaded the internal ledgers. And Sarah was missing. Her car was gone from the heated garage. The meticulously constructed walls of his empire were closing in, crushing the breath from his lungs. The poison pill deadline ticked down in his mind, a lethal countdown set to detonate in a mere matter of days. He needed untraceable cash, and he needed it before the sun rose over the Chugach Mountains. He turned away from the monitor and walked toward the open wall safe hidden behind an oil painting of the Alaskan coastline. He reached inside and pulled out a series of velvet-lined mahogany boxes. The boxes contained Beatrice's prized collections, 18th century enamel miniatures, rare gold coins, and intricate antique timepieces. These were the hard assets she paraded in front of her high society friends, the tangible proof of her superiority. Jackson unzipped a heavy canvas duffel bag on the leather sofa. He began stuffing the velvet boxes inside, not caring if the delicate hinges snapped under the pressure. His movements were frantic, devoid of any calculated grace. He operated purely on raw, terrified survival instinct. "What do you think you are doing?" The cold, imperious voice sliced through the quiet room. Jackson froze, his hand hovering over the duffel bag. He turned slowly. Beatrice stood in the doorway. She wore a floor-length silk dressing gown, the deep emerald fabric shimmering in the dim light of the desk lamp. Her perfectly coiffed hair from the funeral hours prior was now slightly flattened on one side, giving her an unhinged, asymmetrical appearance. Her eyes locked onto the velvet boxes protruding from the canvas bag. "Put those back," Beatrice commanded, stepping into the study. Her tone carried the same icy authority she used to dictate the lives of everyone in her orbit. "Those belong to me." Jackson let out a harsh, jagged laugh. "Nothing belongs to you, Mom. Nothing belongs to us." He grabbed another velvet case from the safe and shoved it into the bag. The syndicate issued a margin call overnight. They want liquidity by 5 o'clock. If I do not wire the funds, they seize the operating accounts. They seize this house. Beatrice marched across the Persian rug, her silk slippers silencing her footsteps. She reached out and snatched the velvet case from his hand. "You will not pawn my family heirlooms like a desperate commoner. Call the bank. Tell them the shipping revenues will cover the interest by next quarter. Use your charm, Jackson. That is what you are good for." He snatched the box right back, his fingers digging into the soft velvet. "Charm does not cover a 7-figure deficit. The ledgers are gone, Beatrice. Do you hear me? Someone copied the shell company data from the secure partition. I found the access logs, unlocked." Beatrice stared at him, her pale face contorting in confusion. "What do you mean, unlocked? I do not even know the passcode to that server." "Exactly," Jackson spat, stepping closer to her. "Only 2 people have access to this study, you and me. And Sarah vanished tonight. She took her car and disappeared right after the funeral. She took the blueprints to our entire financial structure. The moment she hands those files to an auditor, the optical illusion is over. The bridge loans default. The proxy control shatters." Beatrice clutched the collar of her dressing gown, her knuckles stark white against the emerald silk. "Sarah is a weak, terrified little mouse. She does not have the intellect to pull off a corporate theft. You are panicking over a marital dispute. You are ruining a legacy Elias built because you lack the spine to manage a crisis. The mention of Elias Cross acted as an incendiary spark. Jackson's eyes darkened, his jaw clenching so tight the muscle visibly jumped. "Do not talk to me about legacy," he hissed, his voice dropping into a lethal, rhythmic cadence. Elias built a fortune for his actual bloodline. He built it for Aubrey. I spent the last 10 years spinning plates, keeping the creditors distracted, hiding the fact that we are living on borrowed money. I managed your precious high society image. You mismanaged the capital, Beatrice countered, her voice rising to a shrill pitch. You took out predatory loans to fund your own ego. You bought imported cars and custom suits while the shipping contracts dried up. I bought those things to make the bankers believe we possessed the trust, Jackson shouted the sound, echoing off the mahogany bookshelves. The banks only lend money to people who look like they do not need it. I played the part you assigned me. But this entire collapse rests entirely on your shoulders. Beatrice recoiled, letting out a sharp, theatrical gasp. She brought her hand to her chest, attempting to deploy the guilt and manipulation that had served her for decades. How dare you blame me for your staggering incompetence? Save the performance, Mom, Jackson sneered, waving a dismissive hand. There is no audience here. The country club is not watching. This is happening because you left a loose end 10 years ago. You wanted the grand theatrical drama of throwing Aubrey out into the snow. You wanted to play the tragic, abandoned mother. You let her walk away instead of securing the threat. I secured the estate. Beatrice snapped her facade cracking, revealing the vicious underlying reality. I facilitated the medical proxy. I isolated her. You left her alive and angry. Jackson roared, leaning over the desk. If you had just let Dr. Thorne commit her to a locked psychiatric ward permanently, we would not be having this conversation. She would be drugged and confined. The trust would be ours indefinitely. But your monumental ego required a public spectacle. You needed the neighborhood to see her cast out. And now that ghost is back in Anchorage, and my wife is missing with the ledgers. Beatrice opened her mouth to scream a retort, but the sheer intensity of his rage silenced her. The psychological warfare they once combined and directed at Aubrey was now turned inward, tearing their fragile alliance to shreds. They possessed no genuine loyalty. They were parasites feeding off the same stolen host, and the host was gone. Jackson turned away, his chest heaving with exertion. He looked at the heavy crystal decanter resting on the silver bar cart. The amber scotch caught the dim light, glowing like a trapped ember. A sudden, overwhelming wave of destructive fury overtook him. He grabbed the decanter by its thick glass neck. He did not aim for his mother. He hurled the heavy crystal vessel across the room. The decanter slammed into the ornate stone fireplace. The impact was deafening. The thick crystal shattered into hundreds of jagged, razor-sharp fragments. The expensive amber liquid splashed against the white marble, exploding outward in a wide, shimmering arc. The scotch rained down onto the priceless antique Persian rug, bleeding into the intricate woven fibers. The dark stain spread rapidly, soaking the delicate threads like a fatal, expanding wound. The shattering glass punctuated the death of their empire. Jackson stood panting, staring at the ruined rug. Beatrice stood frozen, her hands covering her mouth, her eyes wide with undisguised horror. Neither of them noticed the figure standing in the shadows of the hallway. Sarah stood perfectly still outside the open study doors. She wore her damp wool coat, having crept back into the house through the servants' entrance. She clutched a thick manila folder tight against her chest. Inside the folder were her freshly drafted divorce papers and her expedited passport. She had risked returning to the estate to retrieve her exit strategy while Jackson was distracted. She watched the crystal shards settle on the floorboards. She watched the dark amber liquid bleed into the rug. She looked at the two architects of her misery, standing amidst their own self-inflicted destruction. For 10 years, she feared them. She viewed them as untouchable titans of Anchorage society. Seeing them now, reduced to screaming, panicked animals fighting over the scraps of a stolen fortune, erased every ounce of fear in her veins. Sarah felt no pity. She felt only the cold, hard vindication of a survivor. She turned on her heel, her rubber-soled boots making zero sound against the hallway runner. She slipped out the heavy kitchen door, vanishing into the icy pre-dawn twilight. Back in the study, the silence stretched heavy and suffocating. Jackson stared at the dark stain on the floor, his hands shaking at his sides. The illusion was over. There was no more charming the bankers. There was no more shifting funds. On the mahogany desk, his smartphone lit up. A sharp electronic chime pierced the quiet room. Jackson reached for the device, his thumb swiping across the screen. It was an automated alert from the private banking sector, a formal notice of account restriction. The freeze had officially begun. The Meridian Syndicate Tower stood as a monument to institutional wealth, constructed of cold steel and tinted window glass. It loomed over the Anchorage business district, casting a long gray shadow across the icy pavement. Aubrey Davis pushed through the heavy revolving doors, entering a vast lobby that smelled of polished granite and chilled recycled air. She bypassed the retail tellers on the ground floor, walking directly to the secure elevators reserved for corporate wealth management. She carried her leather tote bag resting against her hip, containing the lethal documents she secured from the broken doctor hours earlier. Aubrey approached the security desk with the practiced authority of a maritime logistics director who navigated rigid corporate hierarchies for a living. Early in her career routing cargo vessels across international waters, she learned a vital lesson about vast institutions. They do not operate on loyalty or emotion. They operate entirely on the fear of liability. If you introduce a structural risk to their balance sheets, they will ruthlessly sever the infected asset to protect the host. Aubrey intended to introduce the ultimate structural risk to her brother's fabricated empire. "I require an immediate meeting with Marcus Caldwell, the Director of Risk Management," Aubrey told the receptionist. Her tone was polite but carried an unyielding weight. The receptionist frowned, looking at her computer screen. "Mr. Caldwell does not take unscheduled appointments. If you would like to leave your name, I can forward your inquiry to his assistant. Inform Mr. Caldwell that the primary collateral securing the Davis estate bridge loans is currently contested under federal fraud statutes," Aubrey replied, keeping her voice steady and low. "Tell him the sole beneficiary of the Elias Cross Blind Trust is standing in the lobby with sworn affidavits proving medical forgery. He will clear his schedule." The receptionist paused, her fingers hovering over the keyboard. She assessed Aubrey's tailored wool coat, her unwavering eye contact, and the sheer gravity of her statement. The receptionist picked up the telephone and dialed a 4-digit extension, speaking in hushed, urgent tones. Less than 2 minutes later, a security guard escorted Aubrey into the private elevator, scanning a key card to grant access to the top floor. The executive suite was a quiet cavern of dark wood paneling and panoramic views of the frozen Cook Inlet. Marcus Caldwell waited in a glass-walled conference room. He was a meticulous man, wearing a crisp, tailored suit and wire-rimmed glasses. He calculated risk for a living, and the sudden appearance of an unannounced heir triggering fraud alerts clearly unsettled his morning routine. "Take a seat, Miss Davis," Caldwell said, gesturing toward the long mahogany table. "You made some very serious allegations downstairs. The Davis estate accounts are in excellent standing. Jackson Davis is a valued client." Aubrey did not sit. She stood at the end of the table, unzipping her leather tote bag. "Jackson Davis is a proxy, operating on fabricated authority," she stated, dealing the facts with pristine efficiency. 10 years ago, he bribed a licensed psychiatrist to declare me legally incapacitated in absentia. He used that fraudulent medical power of attorney to hijack my identity and leverage the Elias Cross Blind Trust as collateral for the high-interest credit lines your syndicate provides. Caldwell stiffened, his posture rigid. "Those are staggering accusations. If you cannot provide undeniable proof, my security team will escort you off the premises." Aubrey reached into the bag and pulled out the thick manila envelope. She opened the flap and slid the documents across the smooth, polished mahogany surface. They fanned out in a neat, precise arrangement. "Read them," Aubrey instructed. Caldwell picked up the first document. It was the genuine psychological evaluation conducted by an independent corporate physician certifying Aubrey's pristine mental health. He moved to the second document, the original, notarized, blind trust mandate bearing the authentic signature of Elias Cross, establishing Aubrey as the sole heir. Finally, he picked up the sworn, written affidavit from Dr. Eris Thorne. The room grew suffocatingly quiet. The only sound was the faint hum of the climate control system and the crisp rustle of thick paper as Caldwell turned the pages. Aubrey watched his eyes dart back and forth across the typed lines. She watched the color drain from his face as the sheer scale of the bank's exposure dawned on him. By accepting fraudulent collateral, the Meridian Syndicate was now entangled in a massive federal conspiracy. The optical illusion of the Davis family wealth was shattered. The blue-chip investments locked in the trust were legally untouchable, and Jackson possessed zero liquid assets to cover the immense debt he accumulated. This affidavit is a confession of medical malpractice and wire fraud. Caldwell murmured, his voice losing its polished corporate edge. He set the paper down, staring at the mahogany wood as if it had suddenly caught fire. If this goes to a federal court, the title on every property, every corporate share, and every vehicle secured under the Davis credit line is instantly clouded. The title is already clouded, Mr. Caldwell Aubrey corrected him, smoothing the lapel of her coat. By presenting this evidence to your risk management division, I have placed your institution on formal legal notice. You can no longer claim ignorance of the contested ownership. Aubrey understood the lethal mechanics of corporate finance. When a property title becomes clouded, the bank cannot legally recognize the asset as valid collateral. Because Jackson's bridge loans were secured entirely by that phantom collateral, the loans defaulted the moment Caldwell finished reading the doctor's confession. The bank had no choice but to initiate an immediate defensive protocol. Caldwell did not argue. He did not ask for time to consult with Jackson. He turned toward his laptop sitting at the edge of the conference table. He logged into the central banking mainframe. His fingers moved rapidly across the keys, calling up the master profiles for the Davis Estate shell companies and personal checking accounts. He highlighted the accounts one by one. Aubrey watched the reflection of the screen in his wire-rimmed glasses. Caldwell hit the enter key. The heavy finality of the banker's keystroke echoed in the quiet office. It was a sharp plastic click that severed a decade of stolen luxury. A hard freeze is initiated. Caldwell stated, his eyes locked on the monitor. All outgoing wire transfers are blocked. All credit lines are suspended indefinitely. The operating accounts are locked pending a full forensic audit. Jackson Davis has zero access to our capital. Thank you for your prompt diligence, Mr. Caldwell, Aubrey said, slipping the original documents back into the manila envelope. My legal counsel will contact your compliance department by tomorrow morning to arrange the rightful transfer of the trust. She turned and walked out of the glass-walled conference room, leaving the banker staring at a screen full of restricted red alerts. Aubrey felt no triumphant surge of adrenaline. She felt the profound, cold satisfaction of a systems architect watching a condemned building implode exactly as she designed it. She systematically dismantled their infrastructure from the roots up without ever raising her voice. Miles away across the snow-covered city, the atmosphere inside the grand family study was suffocating. Jackson sat behind his heavy desk, staring at the amber stains soaking into the ruined Persian rug. The shattered crystal decanter lay in pieces across the floorboards. The mansion was eerily silent. Beatrice had retreated to her bedroom, locking the heavy wooden door. Sarah was gone, leaving no trace of her destination. Jackson dragged his hands down his face, his skin pale and clammy. The wall clock showed noon. He had 5 hours to wire the balloon payment to the syndicate or risk losing the estate. He tried to suppress the rising bile in his throat. He logged into his secure banking portal, entering his credentials with trembling fingers. He pulled up the payment transfer screen. He typed the routing numbers for the offshore shell company, hoping to funnel the last remaining cash reserves into the syndicate account. He entered the 7-figure amount. He moved the mouse cursor, hovering over the submit button. He held his breath, praying the system would process the transaction before anyone realized the internal ledgers were missing. He clicked the mouse. The screen flickered. A bright crimson error message materialized across the display. Transaction denied. Insufficient funds. Account restricted. Jackson blinked, shaking his head. He deleted the numbers and retyped the amount, assuming he made a typographical error. He clicked submit again. The same crimson banner glared back at him, mocking his panic. He navigated to his personal checking account. The balance read 0. He checked the corporate operating funds. 0. Every single financial artery tying him to the modern world was severed. He snatched his smartphone from the desk and dialed his private wealth manager at the Meridian Syndicate. The line rang 4 times before routing to an automated assistant. He hung up and dialed Caldwell directly. The call went straight to a generic voicemail box. The realization hit him with the force of a physical blow. The bankers were ignoring him. In the ruthless hierarchy of Anchorage high society, a frozen bank account was a contagious disease. No one would take his calls. No one would offer a lifeline. He was financially radioactive. Jackson dropped the phone onto the desk. He leaned back in his leather chair, staring blankly at the ceiling. The empire was gone. Across town, Aubrey sat in a quiet coffee shop across the street from the banking tower, sipping a cup of dark roast. She checked her watch. It was early afternoon. The Anchorage Community Foundation Winter Gala began at 7 o'clock tonight. Beatrice and Jackson were expecting to receive a prestigious legacy award in front of the wealthiest families in the state. They would attend, desperate to maintain their facade, unaware that Aubrey had just rendered them entirely destitute. The trap was perfectly set, leaving her family defenseless for the public spectacle to come. Aubrey finished her coffee, preparing to buy a new tailored suit for the evening. She was going to a party. The ballroom inside the Captain Cook Hotel glowed under the warm light of 3-tiered crystal chandeliers. The Anchorage Community Foundation Winter Gala represented the pinnacle of high society in the city. Wealthy philanthropists, local politicians, and corporate executives gathered to celebrate their own benevolence. Waiters in pristine white jackets circulated, carrying silver trays loaded with champagne flutes and delicate appetizers. The air smelled of expensive floral arrangements, roasted duck, and vintage perfume. Tonight, the foundation planned to present the Davis family with an esteemed legacy award, honoring their charitable contributions over the past decade. Those charitable donations originated entirely from the stolen yields of the Elias Cross Blind Trust. Beatrice stood near the center of the room, basking in the radiant glow of her manufactured prestige. She wore a floor-length gown of dark sapphire silk, her hair styled in an immaculate sweep. She held a crystal flute by its delicate stem, projecting the effortless grace of a seasoned aristocrat. Standing next to her was Senator Hughes, a prominent local politician whose campaigns frequently benefited from Davis family funding. "We are finalizing the blueprints for the new pediatric wing," Beatrice told the senator, offering a practiced, modest smile. "David would have wanted us to focus on the children. And after this brutal winter, Jackson and I are planning a prolonged retreat to Europe. We are currently negotiating the purchase of a historic villa in Tuscany. The market is quite competitive, but we never lose out on a property we truly desire." The dramatic irony hung thick in the air. The audience of local elites smiled and nodded, admiring her philanthropic spirit and her vast purchasing power. They did not know the private banking syndicate had executed a hard freeze on her accounts mere hours ago. They did not know the dark sapphire gown she wore was secured by a credit card that would decline if swiped for a cup of coffee. Beatrice remained blissfully unaware, spinning tales of Italian villas while standing on the precipice of total financial ruin. A few feet away, Jackson leaned against a marble pillar, gripping a tumbler of scotch. The tailored tuxedo he wore felt like a suffocating straitjacket. Unlike his mother, he knew the banking portals were locked. He spent the entire afternoon frantically dialing numbers that went straight to generic voicemail boxes. He assumed the bridge loan defaulted early, triggering an automated institutional lockdown. He attended the gala only because failing to appear would signal blood in the water to his competitors. He needed to smile, shake hands, and project unyielding stability while his internal organs twisted into tight, terrified knots. He downed his scotch, the amber liquid burning his throat, providing zero comfort. Beyond the heavy oak doors of the ballroom, Aubrey handed her dark winter coat to the coat check attendant. She did not wear a flowing gown or expensive borrowed jewels. She stepped into the venue wearing a razor-sharp, charcoal-tailored suit, layered over a crisp white silk blouse. The severe lines of the fabric projected terrifying authority. She bypassed the primary guest registry entirely. Sarah provided the vital inside access before fleeing the estate using her status as the committee chair to alter the master seating chart. Aubrey glided into the crowded room, her presence registering as a subtle drop in temperature. She navigated the perimeter, studying the layout with the cold precision of a predator surveying a fenced enclosure. She located table 4, positioned near the front stage, designated for the award recipients. Resting on the pristine white tablecloth next to a sterling silver charger plate sat an elegant, misprinted place card. The foundation calligrapher had written Sarah Davis in sweeping cursive ink, but someone had drawn a single, stark black line through the first name, writing Aubrey above it. It was Sarah's final parting gift, a silent declaration that the rightful heir had returned to claim her seat. Aubrey picked up the place card, folding it neatly and slipping it into her suit pocket. She did not march toward the stage or cause a dramatic shouting match. A public tantrum was a tactic reserved for the weak and desperate. She possessed the lethal evidence, and she intended to distribute it with maximum efficiency. She carried a sleek black leather portfolio under her arm. Inside the portfolio sat a dozen perfectly bound dossiers. Each folder contained the unredacted psychological evaluation, the sworn confession from Dr. Eris Thorne, the authentic trust mandate, and the catastrophic internal ledgers detailing the fraudulent bridge loans. She targeted her recipients with surgical care. Her first stop was the foundation president, a retired judge who valued his pristine reputation above all else. Aubrey approached him near the ice sculpture, offering a polite nod. She handed him a black folder, a necessary supplement regarding tonight's legacy presentation, she murmured, her tone quiet and professional. Please review the medical affidavits on page 3 before calling the Davis family to the podium. She moved seamlessly through the crowd, melting into the background before the retired judge even opened the cover. Her next target was the chief compliance officer for a rival shipping firm. The third folder went to Senator Hughes, who had just excused himself from Beatrice's intoxicating orbit. She distributed the remaining dossiers to the key investors and board members who propped up the Davis social standing. The entire operation took less than 10 minutes. Aubrey retreated to a quiet alcove near the exit, leaning against the cool wall to watch the infection spread. The foundation president opened his folder, adjusting his reading glasses. Aubrey observed his posture stiffen, the color drained from his weathered cheeks as his eyes darted across the doctor's signed confession. He looked up, scanning the room, until his gaze landed on Beatrice. He did not smile. He handed the open dossier to the board treasurer standing beside him. The treasurer read the financial ledgers, his jaw tightening in undisguised horror. The whispers began. It started as a low hum, a subtle shift in the ambient noise of the ballroom. The string quartet continued playing a bright classical melody, but the conversational tone of the room darkened. People leaned in close to one another, exchanging hushed, urgent words behind raised champagne flutes. The chief compliance officer handed his folder to a colleague, pointing a rigid finger at the evidence of wire fraud. Senator Hughes read his copy and immediately signaled his aides, gesturing toward the exit. A politician survives by avoiding proximity to an exploding scandal. The murmur spread through the crowd like a wildfire racing through a dry forest. It was an exact, agonizing mirror of the chapel vestibule 3 days prior. But this time, Aubrey was not the target of their scorn. The collective judgment of Anchorage high society pivoted, redirecting its immense weight toward the woman in the sapphire gown. Beatrice continued laughing at a joke told by a local real estate developer. She lifted her crystal flute to take a sip. As she lowered the glass, she finally noticed the shifting atmosphere. The real estate developer checked his phone, reading a text message from someone across the room. He cleared his throat, offered a strained apology, and quickly walked away. Beatrice frowned, turning to her left. A group of wealthy benefactors who had been eager to speak with her moments ago suddenly turned their backs, forming a tight, exclusive circle. The physical space around Beatrice and Jackson began to expand. The guests were unconsciously taking steps backward, treating the mother and son like a sudden lethal contagion. An unspoken quarantine zone formed in the center of the ballroom. Jackson noticed the void instantly. His heart hammered against his ribs. He looked at the foundation president, who stood near the stage, holding a black folder and glaring at him with pure, unadulterated disgust. Jackson realized the bank freeze was not a technical error. The structural collapse was public. Beatrice felt the cold shoulders pressing in on her. The adoring audience she cultivated for a decade was evaporating before her very eyes. She clutched her champagne flute, looking around the room in frantic bewilderment. Her gaze swept past the averted eyes, the whispering mouths, and the hostile glares. Her sweeping search stopped abruptly when she reached the shadowed alcove near the heavy oak doors. Aubrey stood there, bathed in the dim, ambient light, wearing her charcoal suit. She held no folders, she held no drink. She simply watched the matriarch drown in the silence of her ruined reputation. Beatrice stared at her exiled daughter, the true heir to the Elias Cross fortune and the undeniable architect of this social execution. The trap had snapped shut, breaking the spine of their deception and leaving them stranded on a stage with nowhere left to run. The string quartet concluded their movement, allowing a heavy silence to settle over the ballroom. Judge Harrison, the foundation president, walked slowly toward the elevated stage. He normally moved with the confident stride of a man accustomed to leading the room, but tonight his steps dragged. He clutched the sleek black portfolio Aubrey had handed him earlier, his knuckles strained against the dark leather. He climbed the carpeted stairs and stood behind the clear acrylic podium. He adjusted the microphone, creating a low thud that echoed through the cavernous space. 200 guests turned their attention toward the front, expecting the scheduled legacy presentation. Beatrice straightened her spine, smoothing the front of her sapphire silk gown. She prepared her modest smile, anticipating the warm applause that always validated her existence. This was the moment she craved, the ultimate public coronation of the Davis Empire. She took a half step forward, ready to ascend the stairs and claim her crystal trophy. Judge Harrison did not smile. He did not read from the prepared cue cards resting on the podium. He stared down at the black folder instead. He opened the cover, glancing one last time at the signed medical affidavit and the staggering financial ledgers. He swallowed hard. He looked directly at Beatrice, and then his gaze shifted away, landing on a pair of uniformed security personnel stationed near the kitchen exit. He offered the guards a subtle, sharp nod. "We have a brief delay in our program tonight," the judge announced, his voice rigid and uncomfortable over the sound system. "Please continue enjoying your evening while the board handles an administrative matter." The polite applause never came. The guests exchanged bewildered glances. The quarantine zone around Beatrice widened as more people stepped away, sensing the impending ruin. Her modest smile vanished, replaced by a tight mask of panicked indignation. Her entire identity relied on maintaining control over the narrative. She could not fathom being sidelined at her own celebration. Beatrice broke the invisible barrier. She marched toward the stage, her silk heels clicking sharply against the polished marble floor. She intended to seize the microphone and spin a graceful lie, claiming a minor logistical error. She planned to charm the room and force the judge to hand over the award. She reached the bottom of the stage steps, but her path abruptly closed. Aubrey stepped out from the shadows of the alcove, intercepting the matriarch. The charcoal-tailored suit Aubrey wore stood in stark contrast to the flowing evening gowns surrounding them. She moved with the fluid, lethal efficiency of a logistics director intercepting a compromised shipment. She planted herself firmly at the base of the stairs, blocking Beatrice's ascent. "Get out of my way," Aubrey Beatrice hissed, keeping her voice low to avoid drawing attention. "You have done enough damage with your childish stunts. I am going up there." Aubrey did not move. She looked down at the woman who locked her in a blizzard 10 years ago. The air between them dropped 10 degrees. "I am afraid the Legacy Award has been canceled," Aubrey replied, her tone flat and devoid of emotion. "But the audience still expects a presentation." Before Beatrice could comprehend the statement, Aubrey bypassed her, stepping gracefully up the carpeted stairs. Judge Harrison backed away from the podium, offering no resistance. He recognized the true owner of the Elias Cross fortune and stepped aside, allowing her to take the floor. Aubrey grasped the edges of the acrylic stand. She leaned in close to the microphone. A sharp, high-pitched screech of audio feedback pierced the quiet ballroom. The ear-piercing sound caused several guests to wince and cover their ears. It was a jarring, abrasive noise that commanded total, undisputed attention. The entire ballroom froze. Every eye locked onto the striking woman in the dark suit, standing where the beloved matriarch was supposed to be. "Good evening, Aubrey," said her voice resonant and unyielding, echoing off the crystal chandeliers. "My name is Aubrey Davis. I am the sole biological daughter of Elias Cross and the legal beneficiary of the trust that funded this foundation for the past decade." A collective gasp swept through the wealthy crowd. The name Elias Cross carried immense weight in Anchorage, serving as a bedrock of local industry. Hearing it spoken aloud, tied directly to the exiled Davis daughter, sent a shockwave through the elite attendees. 10 years ago, my brother Jackson Davis engaged in a systemic, coordinated fraud to seize control of my inheritance. Aubrey continued dealing the facts with pristine legal clarity. He bribed a licensed psychiatrist named Eris Thorne to fabricate a psychiatric evaluation declaring me legally incapacitated in absentia. He used that forged medical power of attorney to steal my identity, hijack the blind trust, and fund the lavish lifestyle my family parades in front of you tonight. The ballroom fell into a stunned, breathless silence. The guests stared at Aubrey, absorbing the sheer magnitude of the crime. Beatrice stood frozen at the base of the stairs, her face draining of all color. The sapphire gown suddenly looked like a stolen costume. "The wealth you see them project is an optical illusion," Aubrey stated, her gaze sweeping across the room, locking onto the faces of the investors and board members. "They hold no liquid assets. They operate entirely on high-interest bridge loans secured by phantom collateral." As of noon today, the Meridian Syndicate reviewed the evidence of this forgery. They initiated a hard freeze on all Davis estate accounts, restricting every single credit line and operating fund. She paused, letting the financial execution sink into the minds of the corporate executives standing before her. They understood the gravity of a hard freeze. They knew the Davis family was now undeniably ruined. Furthermore, Aubrey added, her voice dropping to a lethal, calm register, "The signed confessions and financial ledgers have been transferred to federal authorities. At this exact moment, United States Marshals are executing a seizure warrant at the Davis estate. They are locking the gates, confiscating the servers, and impounding the vehicles." Beatrice could no longer maintain her rigid posture. The pristine facade shattered into a million jagged pieces. The reality of her total destruction crashed down upon her. She looked around the room, seeing only disgust and revulsion in the eyes of her former peers. The society she worshipped had instantly rejected her. She lunged forward, grabbing the acrylic podium with trembling hands. "Aubrey, you cannot do this," Beatrice shrieked, her voice raw and unhinged. "We are your family. We raised you. You owe us your loyalty. You are destroying your own blood." Aubrey looked down at the frantic, unraveling woman. She did not feel a trace of pity. She remembered the cold wind tearing through her thin sweater on the frozen porch. She remembered the sound of the deadbolt sliding into place. She remembered the decade of grueling isolation she endured, while this woman sipped champagne bought with stolen money. Aubrey leaned closer to the microphone, ensuring every single person in the cavernous room heard her final verdict. "I am exactly the daughter you raised me to be, Aubrey," said the words slicing through the heavy air like a scalpel. "I just have a better lawyer." The payoff landed with devastating precision. It was a ruthless, calculated strike that left zero room for debate or rebuttal. The crowd stood in stunned awe, witnessing the flawless execution of a decade-long injustice. From the back of the room, Jackson finally broke his paralysis. He shoved past a group of real estate developers, his face flushed a dark, dangerous crimson. He charged toward the stage, his fists clenched, acting on pure, volatile instinct. He intended to drag Aubrey away from the microphone, to silence the truth before it ruined him further. But the Anchorage elite did not stand idly by. As Jackson barreled forward, the wealthy guests physically stepped back, turning their shoulders and creating an impenetrable wall of disdain. They did not touch him, but their unified movement isolated him entirely. A prominent local judge stepped in front of the aisle, blocking his path. 2 foundation security guards flanked the judge, resting their hands on their utility belts. Jackson stopped dead in his tracks. He looked at the faces of the men and women who had eagerly shaken his hand just an hour ago. Their eyes held no sympathy. They viewed him as a toxic liability, a criminal who had conned them all. The quarantine zone solidified, trapping him in a prison of his own making. He was ostracized, severed from the only world he valued. Aubrey stepped away from the podium, leaving the microphone silent. She descended the stairs, walking right past her mother without a second glance. The guests parted for her, offering a wide, respectful path toward the exit. She had delivered the truth and reclaimed her history in front of the entire city. The social execution was pristine, and the financial ruin was undeniable. Yet one final task remained. She needed to drive back to the sprawling estate to reclaim the physical territory they stole from her, ensuring the eviction was carried out with the exact same cold, unyielding authority she just displayed in the ballroom. The morning sun crested the jagged peaks of the Chugach Mountains, casting a stark, bright light across the frozen landscape. The sky was a brittle, piercing blue, devoid of any clouds. The temperature hovered near zero, but the wind had died down, leaving the air crisp and still. A line of vehicles turned onto the private driveway of the Davis estate. Leading the procession were 2 local police cruisers, their roof lights flashing in silent, rhythmic patterns of red and blue. Behind them followed a dark government sedan carrying federal investigators. Bringing up the rear was a sleek black utility vehicle housing Aubrey's contracted corporate property management team. Aubrey sat in the passenger seat of the final vehicle. She wore a heavy wool trench coat and leather gloves. Her posture relaxed, but vigilant. 10 years ago, she was driven away from this exact property in the dead of night, shivering and terrified. Today, she returned in broad daylight, backed by the unyielding weight of the American legal system. The contrast was profound. There would be no screaming matches or frantic scrambles in the snow. She orchestrated a sterile, formal repossession. She let the heavy machinery of the law dictate the terms of their surrender. The convoy parked near the grand portico. Doors opened and heavy boots crunched against the packed ice. The federal agents moved swiftly, bypassing the grand entrance and proceeding directly to the side door. Aubrey stepped out of the utility vehicle, her breath pluming in the frigid air like white smoke. She stood near the base of the grand staircase, watching the methodical execution of the warrants. Within minutes, the heavy oak front door swung open. 2 marshals escorted Jackson out onto the front lawn. He wore the same wrinkled suit from the night before, his tie hanging loose around his collar. His hands were secured firmly behind his back, the cold steel cuffs catching the morning sunlight. He looked exhausted, a hollowed-out shell of the arrogant man who threatened her in the chapel parking lot. The dark circles under his eyes spoke of a sleepless night spent watching his fabricated empire evaporate. He stumbled slightly on the frozen steps, his leather shoes lacking any grip on the ice. The deputies caught his arms, guiding him toward the back of a waiting cruiser. The charge was federal wire fraud, coupled with a state indictment for medical forgery. He did not look at Aubrey. He kept his gaze fixed firmly on the icy pavement, knowing his carefully constructed reality had collapsed into a series of felony charges. He understood that his vast network of purchased loyalty could not save him from a federal mandate. The cruiser door shut with a heavy, definitive thud, sealing him inside. A silver sedan idled near the edge of the sprawling driveway. Sarah sat behind the steering wheel, the engine running, to keep the cabin warm. The trunk was loaded with modest luggage. Her divorce papers were signed, sealed, and filed with the county clerk at the opening of business hours today. She secured her negotiated percentage of the liquid assets, ensuring her safety and independence from the sinking ship. As the police cruiser carrying Jackson drove past her, Sarah rolled down her window just an inch. She locked eyes with Aubrey, who stood tall near the grand staircase. Neither woman spoke a single word. They shared a brief, acknowledging nod, a silent contract fulfilled. Sarah rolled the window back up, shifted her car into gear, and drove away from the estate for the last time. She escaped the wreckage, claiming her freedom. The property management professionals began securing the perimeter. Technicians systematically disabled the old security gates, entering fresh digital access codes into the keypads. Legal representatives walked the property line, placing formal eviction notices on the lower windows. The process was highly efficient, stripping away the personal history of the home and converting it into a secure corporate asset. Aubrey walked up the wide stone steps toward the front porch. A local sheriff deputy walked out of the foyer holding a large metal ring. He stopped in front of Aubrey, holding out his hand. He placed a fresh set of brass keys into her gloved palm. The metal felt heavy and cold, carrying the tangible weight of her reclaimed territory. The deputy offered a polite nod, confirming the locks were officially changed and the residence was legally secured under her name. Aubrey closed her fingers around the keys, feeling the sharp, jagged edges press into her dark leather glove. Beatrice stood in the far corner of the grand porch, refusing to cross the threshold. She wore a heavy mint coat draped over a silk nightgown, clutching a single designer suitcase with trembling hands. Her face was pale, her eyes rimmed with red exhaustion. The staggering arrogance she displayed at the gala was entirely gone. She was a woman stripped of her audience, her leverage, and her stolen wealth. Beatrice watched the deputy hand over the keys, her lower lip quivering. She took a hesitant step toward the edge of the porch, gripping the wooden railing to steady herself. "Aubrey, please," she wept, her voice cracking under the strain of genuine panic. "You cannot put me out here. I am an old woman. I have nowhere to go. My friends will not return my calls. The bank froze my accounts overnight. You won the war. You proved your point to the entire city. Let me stay in the guest wing. I am your mother." Aubrey looked up at the weeping woman. She felt zero hesitation in her chest. She observed the tears spilling over Beatrice's cheeks, realizing they were tears of self-pity, not remorse. Beatrice was not apologizing for the decade of isolation she inflicted. She was simply mourning the loss of her personal comfort. 10 years ago, you locked the deadbolt, while I stood exactly where you are standing now, Aubrey said, her voice calm and even, lacking any trace of vindictive heat. You did not care about the freezing wind then. You only care now because the cold has finally reached your own doorstep. The legal eviction stands as written. A yellow taxicab pulled into the driveway, halting near the edge of the portico. Aubrey had arranged the transportation, predicting this exact scenario. A member of the property management team gently guided Beatrice down the stairs, taking her single suitcase and placing it in the open trunk. Beatrice hesitated, looking back at the towering facade of the mansion she ruled for decades. "Where is he taking me?" she asked, her voice barely above a fragile whisper. Aubrey checked her silver wristwatch. "The driver is taking you to the Pine Ridge complex on the east side of town," Aubrey replied. "I paid the first month of rent for a single-bedroom unit on the ground floor. It is the exact same drafty, dilapidated apartment complex you suggested I move into when you threw me out. I suggest you buy a heavy woolen blanket today. The heating system in those buildings is notoriously unreliable during the winter months." Beatrice let out a soft, wounded sob. The poetic justice of her new, impoverished existence crashed down upon her. She climbed into the back of the yellow cab, pulling the heavy door shut with a trembling hand. The vehicle turned around its tires, crunching loudly on the ice, and drove slowly down the long, winding driveway. The winter that once threatened to end Aubrey's life had now frozen her enemies out, restricting them to the harsh, unforgiving margins of the city. Aubrey stood alone on the grand porch. The estate grew silent. The law enforcement vehicles departed, leaving only the quiet hum of the property management team working inside the vast house. She looked down at the fresh brass keys resting in her palm. The physical territory was reclaimed, but the structural demolition was not yet finished. She needed to step inside the vacant mansion and locate the final, tangible piece of her biological father's legacy. She remembered the vintage emerald brooch Beatrice wore at the funeral, aware that the jewelry held a secret far more valuable than the gemstones resting on its surface. She pushed the heavy oak door open, stepping into the quiet foyer, ready to unlock the vault. The heavy oak door shut behind Aubrey, sealing off the biting Alaskan wind. The foyer stretched out before her, a vast cavern of polished marble and curving mahogany staircases. For the first time in her life, the estate felt entirely silent. The oppressive hum of Beatrice's social machinations and Jackson's frantic pacing had vanished. The property management team worked quietly in the upper wings, cataloging assets and changing security codes, leaving the ground floor empty. Aubrey unbuttoned her wool trench coat, letting it drape over her arm. She walked into the grand family study. The scent of spilled scotch and aged leather hung thick in the air. The shattered remains of a crystal decanter littered the Persian rug, a physical monument to her brother's spectacular collapse. Aubrey stepped around the dark, sticky stain, her boots making a soft, rhythmic tap against the exposed floorboards. Draped carelessly over the back of a tufted leather wingback chair was a dark sapphire evening wrap. It was the same garment Beatrice had worn during her disastrous final moments at the winter gala. In her panicked rush to pack a single suitcase under the watchful eyes of federal marshals, the matriarch had abandoned her most prized accessory. Pinned to the thick silk fabric catching the pale morning light streaming through the frosted window panes, rested the vintage emerald brooch. Aubrey set her coat down and approached the chair. She reached out, tracing the intricate silver filigree surrounding the deep green gemstone. This piece of jewelry had always been an anomaly. Beatrice preferred modern, ostentatious diamonds, yet she guarded this heavy, old-world antique with terrifying ferocity. Aubrey unclasped the pin, freeing the brooch from the fabric. It felt unusually dense in her palm, possessing a weight that defied its size. Carrying the artifact to the expansive mahogany desk, Aubrey sat in the leather chair Jackson had vacated hours prior. She examined the silver backing under the bright glow of the desk lamp. Elias Cross, her biological father, was a man who built international shipping routes. He dealt in high-stakes maritime logistics, a world where extreme wealth required extreme security. A man like that did not leave a blind trust vulnerable to a simple domestic burglary. Aubrey ran her thumb along the ridged edge of the silver casing. She felt a minuscule indentation near the bottom hinge. It was practically microscopic, disguised as a flaw in the antique filigree. She pressed her fingernail into the groove and applied firm, lateral pressure. A sharp, heavy click resonated in the quiet study. The back plate of the brooch sprang open on a concealed hinge. Nestled inside a custom-molded velvet cavity lay a long, intricate, uncut brass key. Aubrey lifted the metal instrument. It was pristine, untouched by oxygen or friction for over 3 decades. It bore a distinct serial number and the faint engraved crest of a renowned private offshore banking syndicate located in Zurich. The final piece of the puzzle locked into place. 34 years ago, Beatrice had engaged in a covert affair with the silent partner of the shipping firm. When Elias Cross died, he left the blind trust mandate, but he also left this physical key, the only instrument capable of unlocking the deepest, most secure vault containing his untraceable liquid assets. Beatrice had stolen it, hiding it in plain sight, ensuring the origins of her infidelity remained buried. She controlled the narrative by wearing the evidence on her lapel. Holding the uncut brass, Aubrey experienced the profound, stabilizing satisfaction of a master builder surveying a freshly cleared demolition site. She had not merely survived a character assassination, she had actively detonated the rotten foundation of her abuser's empire and secured the totality of her rightful inheritance. The physical territory was conquered. Now she needed to reclaim her professional domain. Aubrey opened her leather tote bag and pulled out her secure laptop. She connected to the estate's high-speed network, routing her signal through an encrypted virtual private network. She navigated to her corporate email portal, confronting the bright red suspension banner. She did not bother calling human resources. She drafted a direct, high-priority message to Richard Sterling, the chief executive officer of her maritime logistics firm. The subject line read simply, "Resolution of Fabricated Compliance Crisis." She attached the digitized copies of the genuine psychological evaluation, Dr. Thorne's sworn confession, the authenticated blind trust mandate, and the federal arrest warrants executed against Jackson Davis that very morning. Her accompanying text was brief, clinical, and devoid of any defensive pleading. The allegations of embezzlement regarding offshore shipping routes were a coordinated extortion attempt designed to obscure a sprawling domestic wire fraud operation. She typed her fingers flying across the keys. The architect of this smear campaign, Jackson Davis, is currently in federal custody. The attached legal documentation proves my undisputed ownership of the Elias Cross estate and clears my name of all fabricated compliance violations. I expect my network credentials reinstated by close of business today, and I expect a formal retraction issued to the executive board. I will resume my duties managing the Pacific Northwest Logistics Corridor on Monday morning. She hit send. The digital transmission flew across the fiber optic lines, striking the corporate headquarters in Seattle with the force of a tidal wave. She closed the laptop, waiting in the quiet study. Less than 15 minutes later, her phone vibrated on the desk. The caller ID displayed Richard Sterling's private cellular number. Aubrey answered on the first ring, holding the device to her ear. Aubrey Sterling said, his voice carrying a rare tone of staggered disbelief and newfound deference. I just reviewed the attachments with our general counsel. The scale of this deception is staggering. We had no idea your brother was capable of orchestrating a federal-level compliance hoax. Aubrey looked at the shattered crystal on the rug. Institutions react to risk. Richard, I understand why the firm triggered the suspension, but the risk is now neutralized. The hostile actors are incarcerated. Sterling cleared his throat, eager to mend the fractured professional bridge. Your credentials are being restored right now. The suspension is lifted, effective immediately. The board will receive a full briefing detailing your total exoneration. We need your strategic oversight back on the routing maps, Aubrey. The winter storms are causing extensive delays in the northern transit lanes. I will log into the network in an hour to review the backlog. Aubrey confirmed, her voice projecting cool, unwavering command. Have the logistics team prepare the updated tariff schedules. She ended the call, placing the phone face down on the polished mahogany desk. The red suspension banner on her laptop screen vanished, replaced by the familiar blue glow of her active corporate dashboard. Her career, the armor they tried to strip away in a snowy parking lot, was firmly bolted back into place, stronger and more resilient than ever before. The ghost of her past, the terrified girl shivering on a frozen porch, had been permanently exorcised. She sat in the leather chair, rolling the offshore vault key between her fingers. The war was officially over. The battlefields swept clean. Yet staring out the frosted window at the sprawling, icy Alaskan landscape, Aubrey realized she now possessed an unimaginable fortune and a vast, empty fortress. The destruction was complete, paving the way for a new era. The final step required transforming this vacant monument to betrayal into a legacy that honored the truth, a task that would require every ounce of her strategic brilliance to build something designed to last. 3 weeks passed since the federal vehicles cleared the driveway. The Anchorage winter held its firm grip on the city, coating the expansive grounds of the estate in a thick layer of pristine white snow. Inside the Grand family study, the oppressive atmosphere of paranoia and deceit was entirely eradicated. The ruined Persian rug had been rolled up and incinerated. The shattered crystal was swept away. In their place lay polished oak floorboards gleaming under the warm, ambient glow of a newly lit fire crackling in the stone hearth. Aubrey sat in a wingback chair facing the flames. The ambient heat washed over her face, providing a stark contrast to the bitter chill rattling the frosted window panes. She held a ceramic mug of dark roast coffee, resting her feet near the stone hearth. The sprawling mansion was no longer a prison of whisper networks and orchestrated betrayals. It stood silent and resolute, functioning as a fortress of her own design. She had replaced the domestic staff, upgrading the security protocols and transforming the property into a secure logistical hub for both her corporate career and her private enterprises. Resting on her lap was her secure laptop. The screen displayed the final routing numbers for a staggering international wire transfer. Aubrey had traveled to Zurich days after the gala, presenting the uncut brass key and her authenticated birth records to the private banking syndicate. The vault contents exceeded even her most clinical projections. Elias Cross had stockpiled untraceable, liquid capital gold bullion and bearer bonds, accumulating a fortune designed to outlast any economic downturn. Aubrey repatriated the funds, utilizing the vast resources to systematically reshape the philanthropic landscape of the city. She typed a series of commands, finalizing the incorporation documents for the Elias Cross Foundation. For a decade, her mother and brother had funneled stolen trust yields into vanity projects, demanding their names be etched into hospital wings and community centers. Aubrey dismantled that false legacy with surgical precision. She directed her legal counsel to strip the Davis surname from every charitable endowment in Anchorage. She refunded the donations Jackson had made using fraudulent collateral and replaced them with legitimate, solvent capital from the Zurich vault. Every new grant, every medical research fund, and every pediatric ward contribution now bore the name of her biological father. The elite circles of the city accepted the transition without a single word of protest. The foundation board members who had turned their backs on Beatrice at the Winter Gala now eagerly courted Aubrey's approval. They recognized the true source of the wealth and respected the ruthless efficiency she displayed in reclaiming it. Aubrey engaged with them strictly on a professional level. She attended no high society dinners. She hosted no lavish cocktail parties. She treated the local aristocracy the same way she treated volatile shipping routes, managing them from a calculated distance. A soft chime echoed from the front gate intercom. Aubrey set her coffee mug on the side table and checked the security monitor on her desk. A familiar, rusted domestic pickup truck idled near the perimeter. She pressed a button authorizing access, and the heavy iron gates swung open. Aubrey walked through the quiet foyer, pulling the heavy oak front door open just as the truck parked near the portico. Mrs. Gable stepped out, wrapped in a thick quilted coat and a hand-knit scarf. The retired school teacher carried a small bakery box, stepping carefully across the cleared stone pathway. Aubrey guided the older woman inside, taking her coat and hanging it in the cedar closet. They walked together into the grand study. Mrs. Gable paused in the doorway, taking in the transformed space. Her sharp eyes scanned the polished floors, the roaring fire, and the noticeable absence of the extravagant antique collections Jackson had attempted to pawn. "It feels like a different house," Mrs. Gable noted, walking toward the warmth of the hearth. "It feels like someone can actually breathe in here now." Aubrey nodded, guiding her guest to a comfortable armchair near the fire. "I opened all the windows the first week. I let the winter air cycle through every room. It was necessary to freeze out the lingering decay." She walked over to a silver tea service resting on a low wooden table. She poured steaming Earl Grey into 2 porcelain cups, placing them carefully on saucers. She handed one to Mrs. Gable before taking her own seat. This quiet, peaceful ritual served as a profound nod to the only loyalty that mattered during the darkest parts of the storm. When the entire city believed the smear campaign Mrs. Gable had offered sanctuary, a warm fire, and the neighborhood records that cracked the legal forgery wide open. They sat in comfortable silence for a long moment, listening to the wood popping in the fireplace. "I drove past the Pine Ridge complex yesterday," Mrs. Gable said, blowing gently on her tea. "The maintenance crew was struggling to fix the main boiler. The ground floor units were freezing. I saw Beatrice standing near the lobby windows wrapped in a heavy blanket. She was waiting for a taxi that never arrived." Aubrey took a sip of her tea, her expression remaining perfectly neutral. The bridge loans ruined her credit profile. Aubrey stated, dealing the facts without a trace of malice or pity, she cannot secure private car service. She cannot leverage her social standing to secure favors. She is experiencing the exact isolation she engineered for me 10 years ago. "And your brother?" Mrs. Gable asked, peering over the rim of her cup. The federal prosecutors denied his request for bail. Aubrey replied, her gaze fixed on the dancing flames. "He is currently held in a secure detention facility awaiting trial for wire fraud and conspiracy. His public defender attempted to negotiate a plea agreement, but the evidence provided by the psychiatrist is too comprehensive. He will serve a significant sentence." Sarah finalized her divorce and relocated to the lower 48, using her negotiated settlement to start over. The structural collapse is permanent. Mrs. Gable offered a slow, approving nod. "You did not just defeat them, Aubrey. You erased them." "I corrected a structural failure," Aubrey clarified, setting her cup down. "They built a tower on a rotten foundation, expecting the sheer weight of their lies to hold it together. I simply removed the support pillars and let gravity do the rest." The two women spent the next hour discussing mundane, resilient topics. They talked about the upcoming spring thaw, the local maritime shipping forecasts, and the bakery down the street. Aubrey appreciated the authentic, grounded nature of the conversation. There was no posturing, no hidden agendas, and no desperate grasping for status. It was a genuine human connection built on mutual respect and shared survival. When the afternoon sun began to dip behind the mountains, casting long violet shadows across the snow, Mrs. Gable stood up to leave. Aubrey walked her to the front door, holding it open as the biting evening air rushed into the foyer. "You are a force of nature, Aubrey Davis," the old woman said, pulling her scarf tight around her neck. "Elias Cross would have been incredibly proud to see what you built here." "Thank you, Mrs. Gable," Aubrey replied, offering a rare, genuine smile. "Drive safe on the ice." Aubrey watched the rusted truck disappear down the winding driveway before pushing the heavy oak door shut. The lock engaged with a solid, definitive click. She walked back through the silent, cavernous house, returning to the grand study. The fire had burned down to a cluster of glowing orange embers, radiating a steady, enduring heat. She walked over to the tall, frosted window panes and looked out over the frozen Alaskan landscape. The Chugach Mountains stood tall and unyielding against the darkening sky. 10 years ago, this exact view represented exile. The bitter cold was a weapon wielded against her, a hostile environment designed to break her spirit and force her surrender. Now the winter felt entirely different. The ice and snow were no longer threats. They were mirrors, reflecting her own internal resilience. She had navigated the freezing darkness, surviving the calculated eviction, the whisper networks, and the corporate sabotage. She had not fractured under the intense pressure of her brother's smear campaign. She had adapted, calcified, and returned as an immovable object. Aubrey rested her hand against the cool glass. She felt a profound settling in her chest. The chaotic noise of her childhood, the constant navigating of her mother's narcissistic demands and her brother's desperate greed, was permanently silenced. She was no longer the discarded daughter holding a plastic trash bag on a frozen porch. She was no longer the silent victim of a fabricated compliance crisis. She was the director of her maritime logistics territory, the sole heir to a vast offshore fortune, and the undisputed architect of her own life. The estate was secure, her career was thriving. The false legacy of the Davis family was reduced to ashes and swept away by the brutal Alaskan wind. She had proven that deception, no matter how widely believed or fiercely defended, inherently carries the seeds of its own destruction. Aubrey watched the first stars pierce the twilight sky above the inlet. She was entirely at peace. She had learned the ultimate lesson of survival in this unforgiving territory. Truth, when backed by ironclad patience, strategic silence, and ruthless execution, is not merely a defense. It is the ultimate, unstoppable force of nature. There is a profound, unsettling silence that settles over a home when the foundation of a family finally gives way. It does not sound like the shattering of a crystal decanter or the frantic, desperate shouting in a mahogany study. Those are merely the final, chaotic death rattles of an illusion. The true sound of a family breaking is far quieter. It is the soft, metallic click of a deadbolt sliding into place on a freezing Alaskan night. It is the sound of a mother choosing self-preservation over her child. When we look back at the ashes of the Davis family, we are forced to confront a terrifying reality about the architecture of our own homes. Families do not implode because of a single sudden tragedy. They rot from the inside out, decaying slowly under the weight of 1,000 small, dishonest choices made by the people entrusted to lead them. At the heart of this collapse lies a masterclass in the catastrophic failure of parenting. In traditional American culture, the family structure is idealized as a sanctuary, a fortress meant to protect its members from the harsh, unforgiving winters of the outside world. Parents are the architects of that sanctuary. They are tasked with laying a foundation built on honesty, fairness, and unconditional emotional support. Beatrice Davis did not build a sanctuary. She built a stage set. She utilized her children not as human beings to be nurtured, but as props to uphold a manufactured image of elite societal perfection. By hiding the truth of Aubrey's parentage, Beatrice introduced a toxic, silent poison into the bloodstream of her home. She punished her daughter for a secret she herself created, turning a child into a living, breathing liability. This is the supreme danger of raising children without emotional awareness or fundamental fairness. When parents designate a golden child, as Beatrice did with Jackson, they are not setting that child up for success. They are actively crippling them. Jackson was raised on a diet of unearned entitlement and maternal protection. He was taught that charm manipulation and the right tailored suit could bend reality to his will. He was shielded from the consequences of his own incompetence. As a result, when faced with genuine adversity, when the bridge loans collapsed and the illusion shattered, he had no internal scaffolding to hold himself up. He became a cornered, frantic animal, entirely incapable of navigating the storm. By protecting him from accountability, his mother engineered his ultimate destruction. Conversely, Aubrey was cast into the role of the scapegoat. She was subjected to a decade of emotional isolation, culminating in a literal exile into a deadly blizzard. Yet the very cruelty intended to break her became the crucible that forged her ironclad resilience. She learned to regulate her emotions because she had no one else to rely on. She developed a profound clinical awareness of human behavior because anticipating the shifting moods of her abusers was a matter of basic survival. We often speak of preparing our children for the real world, but we rarely acknowledge the tragic irony that sometimes the most brutal preparations occur at the hands of the parents themselves. Aubrey survived the winter because she was forced to become it. But we must ask ourselves, at what cost? Independence born of betrayal is a heavy, lonely armor to wear. The American dream often confuses material wealth with moral success. We look at sprawling estates, vintage emerald brooches, and philanthropic legacy awards, and we assume the people holding them are inherently worthy. But true family responsibility cannot be bought with high-interest credit lines or displayed in a velvet box. Genuine responsibility requires the courage to look at your children and tell them the truth, even when it exposes your own flaws. It requires the emotional maturity to treat each child with equity, rather than pitting them against one another in a desperate competition for affection and resources. When parents prioritize the optics of success over the integrity of their character, they teach their children that love is transactional, and loyalty is simply a commodity to be bought and sold. The emotional awareness lacking in the Davis household is a cautionary tale for any parent. Children are incredibly perceptive barometers of truth. They feel the uneven distribution of warmth in a home. They hear the subtext in a mother's fake theatrical tears at a funeral. When a parent weaponizes their own emotions, using grief, guilt, or anger to manipulate a child, they permanently sever the bond of trust. Aubrey did not shed a tear during her mother's eulogy because she had long ago realized that her mother's sorrow was just another tool of coercion. To raise healthy, functional adults, parents must cultivate an environment where emotions are processed openly and honestly, not deployed as tactical weapons in a covert domestic war. Long-term guidance means preparing children to build their own lives, not chaining them to the ghosts of the past. Jackson was chained to a stolen legacy, forced to manage a crumbling empire that was never rightfully his, simply to maintain his mother's pride. He was a prisoner of the deception just as much as Aubrey was its victim. If there is a lesson to be extracted from the wreckage of the Davis estate, it is that deception carries an exorbitant interest rate, and the debt always comes due. The truth possesses a relentless, undeniable gravity. You can bury it under forged medical documents, you can hide it behind a private banking syndicate, and you can lock it out in the freezing snow. But it will eventually find its way back to the front porch. As we navigate the complex, often chaotic waters of raising our own families, we must fiercely guard against the temptation to build our homes on optical illusions. The walls we construct around our children must be made of accountability, transparent love, and unwavering fairness. If we fail in this, if we choose the comfort of a lie over the difficult labor of the truth, we risk creating a dynamic where our own children must destroy us just to survive. We must strive to be parents who open the door when the blizzard hits, rather than the ones who slide the deadbolts shut. It is stories like Aubrey's that remind us of the incredible, terrifying power we hold over the lives we bring into this world. They force us to examine the quiet, hidden corners of our own relationships and the unspoken contracts we make with our loved ones. If you find value in these deep, unflinching explorations of family dynamics, betrayal, and the profound resilience of the human spirit, I invite you to become part of our community. Please subscribe to the channel Linda Vengeance. We are dedicated to bringing you quiet stories about ordinary people who stop apologizing for taking up space and who finally demand the truth they have always deserved. Join us and ensure the next story finds you when you need it most. In the end, Aubrey Davis stood in a quiet, grand study, looking out over a frozen Alaskan landscape, finding profound peace. She had reclaimed her history and secured her future. But the house she stood in was empty. The victory, while undeniable, required the systemic demolition of the very people who were supposed to love her unconditionally. It leaves us to wonder about the spaces we occupy and the people we hold dear. When the storms of life inevitably arrive and the temperature drops, what kind of legacy will you be standing in? Will your home be a fortress warmed by the fires of honesty and mutual respect? Or will you find yourself standing alone in a beautiful, hollow room, listening to the wind rattle the glass, wondering if the people you love are safely inside, or if you were the one who left them out in the cold?